The cards hit the table with a slap that echoed through the Lucky Star Saloon like a death sentence. Ethan Cole, the fastest gun and smoothest talker in all of Arizona territory, stared at his losing hand while whiskey burned in his gut and laughter roared in his ears. He'd bet everything on kings and aces, but fate had other plans. His punishment wasn't a bullet or a beating. It was worse. Marriage. To Clara Dawson, the silent shopkeeper's daughter who'd never spoken more than 3 words to anyone, the wildest man in Coyote Ridge was about to be shackled to its quietest woman. Stay with me until the very end of this story and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this tale travels across the world. The summer of 1875 burned across the Arizona territory like God's own furnace, turning the red dust of Coyote Ridge into powder, fine enough to choke a man's dreams. The town squatted in a valley between 2 ridges of sun-bleached rock, a collection of weathered buildings that seemed determined to prove civilization could take root anywhere, even in hell. Ethan Cole had ridden into Coyote Ridge 3 years prior with nothing but a horse, a gun, and a smile that could charm the rattle off a snake. He'd made his living at cards and his reputation with lead, and by the time that fateful August evening rolled around, there wasn't a soul in town who didn't know his name. Some spoke it with admiration, others with contempt, most with a mixture of both. The Lucky Star Saloon stood at the corner of Main Street and Prosperity Lane, a name that was more wishful thinking than reality. Its false front rose 2 stories high, painted a faded red that had been bright once, back when someone still believed in the future. Inside, the air hung thick with tobacco smoke, sweat, and the sour-sweet smell of spilled whiskey. A piano player named Chester worked the keys in the corner, playing songs that were more rhythm than melody, and the sound mixed with the constant murmur of voices, the clink of glasses, and the shuffle of cards. It was Saturday night, and the saloon was packed with cowboys, miners, drifters, and gamblers, men whose hands bore the marks of their trades and whose eyes held the hard gleam of those who'd learned life's lessons the painful way. Ethan sat at his usual table near the bar, a position that let him watch both doors while keeping his back to the wall. Old habits died hard, and Ethan had collected more than his share of enemies over the years. "Another round, gentlemen?" Ethan asked, his voice carrying that easy confidence that made men either want to be him or punch him. His dark hair fell across his forehead in a way that somehow managed to look both careless and carefully arranged. His gray eyes, the color of storm clouds over the desert, swept the table as he gathered the cards for another deal. Across from him sat Buck Morrison, a cattle rancher whose spread covered 3,000 acres north of town. Buck's face was weathered leather, his hands thick and calloused, his disposition as mean as a rattlesnake with a toothache. He'd been losing all night, and with each hand his mood had darkened like thunderclouds building on the horizon. "Deal the damn cards, Cole," Buck growled, shoving a stack of chips toward the center of the table. "My luck's about to change. I can feel it." To Buck's left sat Tommy Chen, who ran the general store his father had established 20 years ago when the railroad surveys first suggested Coyote Ridge might amount to something. Tommy was young, barely 25, with quick hands and a quicker mind. He'd been holding his own all evening, playing careful poker that won small and lost smaller. The fourth player was a stranger, a man who'd introduced himself simply as Mr. Smith and had produced a roll of bills thick enough to suggest either great success or recent theft. He wore a black suit that had seen better days, a hat pulled low over his eyes, and he played with the methodical precision of someone who'd learned cards in Mississippi riverboats rather than frontier saloons. "5-card draw," Ethan announced, his fingers dancing through the deck with practiced ease. "Ante up, boys. Lady Luck is a fickle mistress, but she's always got a weakness for a handsome face and a willing wallet." The cards whispered across the felt as Ethan dealt, each man receiving 5 pieces of pasteboard that could mean fortune or ruin. The poker table was democracy at its finest. It didn't matter if you were a rancher or a shopkeeper, a drifter or a gambler. All that mattered was what you held in your hand and how well you could lie about it. Ethan picked up his cards slowly, savoring the moment. Kings and aces, 2 pair right out of the gate. Not a sure thing, but strong enough to build on. He kept his face carefully neutral, but inside his pulse quickened. This was the feeling he lived for, the moment when possibility hung in the air like morning mist over the creek. The betting started small. Tommy opened with $5. Mr. Smith called. Buck raised it to 10, his jaw set in that stubborn line that said he was determined to win or die trying. Ethan called and raised another 5, pushing the pot to respectable territory. Cards? Ethan asked, though he already knew what each man would do. You could read a lot from watching how a man held his hand, how he breathed, how he looked at his chips. Tommy took 2 cards. Mr. Smith took 1, a bold play that suggested either a straight or a flush in progress. Buck hesitated, then took 3, which meant he was probably holding a pair and hoping for magic. When it came to Ethan, he discarded 3 cards, keeping his 2 pair, and dealt himself 3 more. The new card slid into his hand. Jack, Queen, King. 3 kings now. A full house if he still had those aces, and he did. He had to fight to keep the smile off his face. This was the kind of hand that won big pots and made reputations. The second round of betting was where the real game began. Tommy bet $20, a substantial sum that said he'd improved his hand. Mr. Smith called without hesitation. Buck stared at his cards like they'd personally insulted him, then pushed all his remaining chips forward. "I'm all in," Buck declared, his voice rough with whiskey and frustration. $160. Let's see who's got the spine to match it. Ethan looked at his stack of chips. He had about $200 in front of him. A good night's work, enough to keep him in comfort for a month if he was careful. The smart play was to fold, take his winnings, and live to play another day. But Ethan Cole had never been accused of being smart. Careful, yes. Skilled, absolutely. But never smart when there was a chance to prove something. "I'll see your 160, Ethan said, counting out chips with steady fingers. "And raise you another 40. $200 says my hand beats yours." A murmur ran through the crowd that had gathered to watch. $200 was serious money, enough to buy a horse, a gun, and supplies to start a new life somewhere else. The kind of money that could change a man's circumstances considerably. Tommy folded immediately, shaking his head. "Too rich for my blood. Good luck, gentlemen." Mr. Smith studied his cards for a long moment, then looked at Ethan with eyes that revealed nothing. "I fold as well. This hand belongs to you two." Which left Ethan and Buck staring at each other across a pot that now held close to $400. The piano had stopped. Every conversation in the saloon had died. All eyes were on the table. "Call," Buck said, but his voice had a tremor in it that betrayed his doubt. He shoved his last chips forward, then looked up at Ethan with something desperate in his eyes. "But I'm short about $40. "Then you can't call," Ethan said, starting to reach for the pot. "Thanks for the game, Buck. Better luck next." "Wait." Buck's hand shot out, gripping Ethan's wrist with surprising strength. "I've got something worth $40. "Hell, worth a lot more than that. You just gotta be man enough to take it." Ethan pulled his arm back slowly. "I'm not interested in cattle, Buck. I don't have anywhere to keep them." "Not cattle." Buck's lips twisted into something that might have been a smile if it held any humor. "A wife." The word dropped into the silence like a stone into still water, sending ripples of shocked laughter through the crowd. Ethan blinked, certain he'd misheard. "A wife? What the hell are you talking about?" Buck leaned back in his chair, and now his smile was wider, meaner. "You heard me. You win this hand, you marry Clara Dawson, the shopkeeper's daughter, the quietest, meekest, most boring woman in all of Coyote Ridge. Hell, in all of Arizona Territory." More laughter now, louder. Someone in the back shouted, "That's cold, Buck!" Another voice called out, "Poor girl don't deserve that fate." Ethan shook his head. "You can't bet a woman, Buck. That's insane." "Can I? She's 23 years old, never been courted, never been kissed as far as anyone knows. Her daddy would probably pay someone to take her off his hands. Girl barely speaks, just stares at people with those big eyes like she's somewhere else entirely. You win. You marry her. I win. I take the pot. That's my bet." The saloon had erupted into chaos. Men were shouting their opinions, laying side bets on whether Ethan would accept, whether Clara Dawson would go through with it, whether this was the funniest or the cruelest thing they'd ever witnessed. Ethan sat frozen, his cards suddenly feeling like lead weights in his hand. He'd seen Clara Dawson, of course. Everyone in Coyote Ridge had. She worked in her father's store, a silent ghost who moved between the shelves like smoke, filling orders and making change without ever quite meeting anyone's eyes. She wore her dark hair in a simple bun, dressed in plain dresses the color of dust and shadow, and carried herself with a stillness that was almost unnerving. Ethan had spoken to her perhaps 3 times in 3 years, and each time she'd responded with nothing more than a nod or a whispered, "Yes, sir." The idea of marrying her was absurd. Marrying anyone was absurd. Ethan Cole wasn't the marrying kind. He was a gambler, a drifter, a man who kept his belongings in a single saddlebag because he never knew when he might need to ride out fast. But pride was a funny thing. It made men do foolish things. And right now, with the whole saloon watching, with Buck Morrison's mean smile daring him to back down, with $400 on the table and his reputation on the line, Ethan felt pride burning in his chest like swallowed fire. "You're drunk, Buck," Ethan said, trying one last time to inject sanity into the situation. "We're all drunk. Let's just—" "Scared?" Buck interrupted. "The great Ethan Cole, fastest gun in Arizona, afraid of one little mouse of a woman? Hell, boys, maybe all them stories we heard were just talk after all." That did it. Ethan felt something snap inside him, some combination of whiskey and pride and sheer stupid stubbornness that had gotten him into trouble more times than he could count. "Fine," Ethan said, his voice cutting through the noise like a knife. "Fine. I accept your bet, Buck Morrison. I win this hand, I marry Clara Dawson. You win, you take the pot. But when I win, and I will win, you're going to be the one who explains this idiocy to her father. Deal?" Buck's smile was triumphant. "Deal. Show your cards, Cole." Ethan laid his cards on the table with a flourish that belied the sudden anxiety clawing at his gut. "Full house, ye kings over aces." It was a damn good hand. In most games, it would be unbeatable. Buck stared at the cards for a long moment, and Ethan allowed himself to relax. This was over. He'd call off this stupid bet, maybe buy Buck another drink, and Buck laid down his cards slowly, deliberately, savoring each moment. 4 sevens. 4 of a kind. 4 sevens beat a full house every single time. The saloon exploded. Men were shouting, laughing, pounding tables in each other's backs. Money exchanged hands as side bets were settled. Chester, the piano player, launched into a wild rendition of "Oh, Susanna" for no reason anyone could determine. And through it all, Ethan sat frozen, staring at those 4 sevens like they were rattlesnakes coiled to strike. "Looks like you're getting married, Cole," Buck roared, sweeping the chips toward himself with both hands. "Welcome to respectability. Welcome to responsibility. Welcome to the end of your wild days." Ethan couldn't speak, couldn't move. His mind was reeling, trying to find a way out, trying to understand how his luck had turned so completely and catastrophically in a single moment. "Now hold on," he finally managed. "This was just talk. Just drunk men making drunk bets. Nobody's actually going to—" "A bet's a bet," Mr. Smith said quietly, speaking for the first time since folding. His voice carried an authority that cut through the chaos. "I witnessed it. Everyone here witnessed it. You want to be known as a man who welshes on his debts, Mr. Cole?" "This ain't a debt. This is insanity. This is honor," Mr. Smith continued, his eyes boring into Ethan's. "Out here, a man's word is all he has. You agreed to the terms. Buck won. Unless you want everyone in this territory to know that Ethan Cole's promises mean nothing, you'll honor this bet." The saloon had gone quiet again, waiting for Ethan's response. He looked around at the faces surrounding him, some amused, some curious, some pitying. These were the men he drank with, played cards with, told stories with. These were his people, his community such as it was. If he backed out now, if he showed himself to be a man without honor, he might as well pack his bags and ride out because he'd never be able to show his face in Coyote Ridge again. "Fine," Ethan heard himself say, the word bitter as alkali water in his mouth. "Fine. I'll do it. I'll marry Clara Dawson." The cheering that erupted was deafening. Buck bought a round for the house, with Ethan's money, which added insult to injury. Men clapped Ethan on the back, offering congratulations and condolences in equal measure. Someone started a betting pool on how long the marriage would last. The general consensus seemed to be that Ethan would run within a month, though a few optimists gave him 3. Ethan barely heard any of it. He pushed away from the table, grabbed the whiskey bottle Buck had been drinking from, and took a long pull straight from the bottle. The liquor burned down his throat but did nothing to ease the cold dread settling in his stomach. What had he done? By the time the sun rose the next morning, painting the Arizona sky in shades of pink and gold, the entire town of Coyote Ridge knew about the bet. Stories spread faster than wildfire in small towns, and a story this good, this scandalous, this ridiculous, spread faster than most. Ethan woke with a headache that felt like someone was driving railroad spikes through his skull, and a sense of impending doom that was even worse. For a blessed moment, he couldn't remember why he felt such dread. Then memory crashed back like a bucket of creek water, and he groaned, pulling his pillow over his face. He'd agreed to marry Clara Dawson. Clara Dawson. The quietest woman in town. The girl who never spoke, never smiled, never seemed to fully exist in the world around her. And he was supposed to marry her because of a card game. There had to be a way out. There had to be. Ethan had talked his way out of tighter situations than this. He'd smooth-talked his way past jealous husbands, angry fathers, and suspicious sheriffs. Surely he could find a way to wriggle free from one impossible marriage. He dragged himself out of bed in the small room he rented above the saddle shop and made his way down to the street. His plan was simple. Go to the Dawson General Store, explain to Clara and her father that this had all been a terrible drunken mistake, apologize profusely, maybe offer some money for their trouble, and call the whole thing off. Clara would probably be relieved. Hell, she'd probably be grateful to escape marriage to a gambler and drifter like him. The morning was already hot, the sun beating down with that relentless intensity that characterized Arizona summers. Coyote Ridge was coming to life. Shops opening, horses being led to the livery, women with baskets heading to market. And every single person Ethan passed seemed to know about the bet. "Congratulations on your engagement, Mr. Cole," called Mrs. Henderson, the seamstress, with a smile that was pure mischief. "Hope you're ready for the ball and chain," shouted Pete Mallory from outside the blacksmith shop, causing his companions to roar with laughter. "Ethan Cole getting married? Never thought I'd see the day." This from old Sam Tucker, who sat in his usual spot outside the saloon even though it was barely 8 in the morning. Ethan ignored them all, his jaw set, his eyes fixed on the Dawson General Store at the end of Main Street. The store was a solid 2-story building, one of the oldest in town, with large windows displaying everything from canned goods to farming equipment. Above the door, painted in neat black letters, Dawson and Daughter General Merchandise. The bell above the door chimed as Ethan entered, and he found himself in the familiar interior of the store. Shelves lined every wall, stocked with everything a frontier town might need: flour and sugar, fabric and thread, tools and nails, medicines and soaps. The air smelled of wood and leather and coffee, a combination that was oddly comforting. Behind the counter stood Malcolm Dawson, Clara's father. He was a lean man in his 50s with gray hair and sharp blue eyes that were currently fixed on Ethan with an expression that could have meant anything from amusement to anger. "Mr. Cole," Malcolm said, his voice carefully neutral. "I've been expecting you." "Mr. Dawson," Ethan replied, removing his hat in a gesture of respect he didn't entirely feel. "I suppose you've heard about how you agreed to marry my daughter because of a poker hand?" "Yes, Mr. Cole. The entire town has heard. Mrs. Henderson stopped by first thing this morning to make sure I knew, in case the 5 people who told me yesterday evening hadn't been clear enough." Ethan winced. "Sir, I want to apologize. This whole thing is—" "Clara," Malcolm called, cutting Ethan off. "Come out here, please." There was a moment of silence, and then Clara Dawson emerged from the back room. Ethan had seen her before, but he'd never really looked at her. Not properly. Now standing in the morning light streaming through the store windows, he found himself actually seeing Clara Dawson for the first time. She was small, barely reached his shoulder, with a slim build that suggested she'd never had much excess in her life. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple bun, revealing a face that was all delicate bones and pale skin. But it was her eyes that caught him. They were dark brown, almost black, and they held a depth that seemed to contradict everything he'd heard about her being simple or dull. When she looked at him, Ethan felt like she was seeing straight through him, reading every thought and secret he'd ever had. "Clara," Malcolm said gently, "this is Ethan Cole." I believe you know who he is. Clara nodded, her gaze never leaving Ethan's face. She didn't speak. Mr. Cole has come to discuss the arrangement, Malcolm continued. The one where he agreed to marry you because he lost at cards. Sir, Ethan jumped in, desperate to take control of this conversation. I came here to apologize. This whole situation is absurd. Your daughter shouldn't have to suffer because I made a foolish, drunken bet. I'm willing to compensate you both for any embarrassment this has caused, and we can simply forget this ever— Do you want to marry him, Clara? Malcolm asked, as if Ethan hadn't spoken at all. The question hung in the air. Ethan stared at Malcolm, then at Clara, waiting for her to shake her head, to say no, to give him the escape route he desperately needed. Clara looked at her father, then back at Ethan. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft but clear, the voice of someone who didn't waste words but knew exactly which ones to use. Yes, she said simply. I'll marry him. Ethan felt the floor tilt beneath his feet. What? No. Miss Dawson, you don't understand. I understand perfectly well, Mr. Cole. Claire's voice was still quiet, but there was steel underneath it now. You made a bet. You lost. A man's honor means keeping his word, doesn't it? Or were all those stories about Ethan Cole's integrity just tall tales? She was throwing his own reputation back at him. The gambler with the code, the gun for hire, who never broke a contract, the man who could be trusted to keep his word even when it cost him. She was using his own mythology to trap him. This is different, Ethan protested weakly. This is a bet you agreed to witness by a saloon full of people, Clara interrupted, and now there was something almost fierce in her expression. You want to back out? Fine. Walk out that door and let everyone in Coyote Ridge know that Ethan Cole's promises mean nothing, that he's willing to humiliate a woman to save himself from an inconvenience, that his honor only matters when it's convenient. Malcolm was watching his daughter with an expression of surprise and something that might have been pride. Clearly, this was more words than Clara usually spoke in a week. Ethan felt trapped. He'd come here expecting meekness, expecting to easily extricate himself from this mess. Instead, he'd found himself facing a woman who understood exactly how to manipulate him, not with tears or pleading, but with the one thing he valued most: his reputation, his honor. Why? Ethan asked desperately. Why would you want to marry me? You don't even know me. This is insane. Clara looked at him for a long moment, and Ethan saw something flicker in those dark eyes, something sad and resigned and strangely determined all at once. I'm 23 years old, Mr. Cole, she said quietly. In this town, that makes me a spinster. No one courts me. No one looks at me. I'm the quiet girl, the strange girl, the one who doesn't quite fit. My father won't be around forever. And when he's gone, what happens to me? Do I run this store alone? Do I become the pitied old maid everyone whispers about? She paused, lifting her chin slightly. At least this way I'll be married. At least this way I'll have a place in the world, even if it's to a gambler who sees me as a burden he can't escape. The words hit Ethan like physical blows. He'd been so caught up in his own anger and embarrassment that he hadn't considered Clara's perspective at all, hadn't thought about what it might mean to be a woman in a frontier town, unmarried and getting older, with limited options and even more limited prospects. Clara, Malcolm began, his voice thick with emotion. It's the truth, Father, Clara said, still looking at Ethan. We both know it. So here's my offer, Mr. Cole. Marry me. Give me your name and a place in the world. You can keep living however you want. I won't burden you with expectations of affection or fidelity. All I ask is that you don't humiliate me publicly. In exchange, I'll keep house for you, manage whatever household we establish, and ask nothing more than basic respect. It was the most business-like proposal of marriage Ethan had ever heard. No romance, no pretense, just a cold transaction laid out in plain terms. And somehow, that made it impossible to refuse. Because she was right. He had made a bet. He had agreed to terms. And every man in Coyote Ridge was watching to see what he would do. If he walked away now, he might as well pin a sign to his chest that read, "Coward and Liar." Ethan stood there in the sunlight streaming through the store windows, feeling the trap close around him with the finality of a cell door slamming shut. He thought about running, about saddling his horse and riding out of Coyote Ridge and never looking back, starting over in California or Colorado or Mexico where no one knew his name. But he'd spent 3 years building a reputation in this town, 3 years proving he was a man of his word, and Clara was right. All of that would mean nothing if he backed out now. "All right," Ethan heard himself say, his voice sounding distant and strange to his own ears. "All right, I'll do it. We'll get married." Malcolm let out a breath he'd apparently been holding. Claire's expression didn't change, but something in her eyes softened slightly. "When?" Malcolm asked. "Might as well get it over with," Ethan said bitterly. "How about Saturday? That gives people a week to place their bets on how quickly I'll run." "Saturday it is," Malcolm agreed. "I'll speak to Reverend Morrison." "Any relation to Buck?" Ethan asked sharply. "His brother," Malcolm admitted. "But Reverend Morrison is a good man, not like Buck. He'll perform the ceremony proper." Perfect. Even the Reverend would be connected to the man who'd caused this disaster. Ethan jammed his hat back on his head, suddenly desperate to be anywhere but here. "I'll see you Saturday then," he said, heading for the door. "Mr. Cole," Clara called, stopping him just as his hand touched the doorknob. He turned back. She was still standing behind the counter, small and still and somehow indomitable. "Thank you for keeping your word. I know this isn't what you wanted." "It's not what either of us wanted," Ethan replied. "But I guess we're both trapped now, aren't we?" He walked out before she could respond, the bell chiming mockingly as the door closed behind him. The next week passed in a blur of preparations that Ethan wanted no part of. The town, having collectively decided this was the most entertaining thing to happen in years, threw itself into wedding preparations with enthusiasm that bordered on mania. Mrs. Henderson sewed Clara a wedding dress. Nothing fancy, just a simple white dress with lace at the collar and cuffs, but made with care. The ladies' auxiliary organized a reception at the church hall. Someone commissioned a cake from Sally Winters, who baked the best cakes in 3 counties. Men placed bets not just on how long the marriage would last, but on everything from whether Ethan would actually show up to whether Clara would speak her vows loud enough to be heard. Ethan spent the week drinking more than usual and avoiding everyone who wanted to offer advice, congratulations, or condolences. He considered running at least a dozen times. Once, he actually saddled his horse at midnight, intending to ride out. But he'd sat there in the livery stable, his hand on the reins, and couldn't make himself do it. Damn his pride. Damn his reputation. Damn his sense of honor that wouldn't let him be the kind of man who broke his word. Saturday arrived with the inevitability of the hangman's noose. The ceremony was set for 2 in the afternoon, when the heat would be at its worst. A detail that seemed fitting to Ethan. Everything about this was uncomfortable and awful, so why not add physical misery to the mix? He put on his best clothes, a white shirt he'd had cleaned special, a black vest, dark trousers, and boots he'd actually polished. He looked at himself in the mirror above his wash basin and barely recognized the man staring back. When had he become someone who got married? Someone who had responsibilities and obligations beyond where his next card game would be? The church was packed when Ethan arrived. It seemed like every single person in Coyote Ridge had turned out for the spectacle. Reverend Morrison stood at the altar, his expression carefully neutral. Buck Morrison sat in the front pew, grinning like he'd just won the lottery, which, Ethan reflected bitterly, he had. Ethan took his place at the altar, his hands clenched at his sides, trying to ignore the whispers and stares. The church was small, simple, just wooden pews and plain walls and a cross above the altar. No stained glass, no fancy decorations. A frontier church for a frontier town. Then the door opened, and Clara walked in on her father's arm. She was beautiful. The thought struck Ethan with surprise that bordered on shock. He'd thought of Clara as plain, forgettable, someone who faded into the background. But in her white dress, with her hair down around her shoulders for once instead of pinned up, with spots of color high on her cheeks, and her dark eyes bright with what might have been fear or determination, or both, she was genuinely beautiful. She walked down the aisle with measured steps, her gaze fixed on the altar. When she reached Ethan's side, Malcolm placed her hand in Ethan's, and Ethan felt the tremor running through her fingers. She was terrified as he was, maybe more so. For the first time since this whole disaster began, Ethan felt something other than anger and resentment, He felt a flicker of sympathy for this woman who was being shackled to him just as surely as he was being shackled to her. "Dearly beloved," Reverend Morrison began, and Ethan stopped listening. The words washed over him like creek water, meaningless sounds that would somehow transform his entire life. He responded when prompted, said, "I do," when required, and heard Clara's whispered, "I do," in response. Rings were exchanged, simple gold bands that Malcolm had provided. Ethan slid one onto Clara's finger, feeling the strange weight of the ring on his own hand as she did the same. "I now pronounce you man and wife," Reverend Morrison declared. "You may kiss your bride." Ethan turned to Clara, and for a moment they just looked at each other. Two strangers, now bound together by law and custom and a stupid bet over cards. He leaned down, intending to give her the briefest, most impersonal kiss possible, just enough to satisfy the requirement. But when his lips touched hers, something unexpected happened. Clara's lips were soft and warm, and for just a second, barely a heartbeat, she leaned into the kiss instead of pulling away. It wasn't passionate or wild or anything dramatic, but it was real, human, a moment of connection in the midst of this forced ceremony. Then it was over, and they were turning to face the congregation, which erupted into applause and cheers. Ethan felt Clara's hand tighten on his arm, felt her trembling even as she held her head high. "Well," Ethan murmured, pitching his voice low enough that only she could hear. "We did it. We're officially the town's biggest spectacle." "At least now they'll have something else to talk about soon enough," Clara replied just as quietly. "Some other scandal will come along." "Let's hope so," Ethan said. "Let's hope so." The reception was held in the church hall, a large room that served as the town's general gathering space for everything from dances to town meetings. Tables had been set up with food and punch. No alcohol, since Reverend Morrison didn't approve of spirits at church functions, which Ethan thought was a crying shame given the circumstances. People surrounded them offering congratulations that ranged from sincere to mocking. Clara handled it with grace, smiling and thanking people, playing the role of blushing bride with a skill that surprised Ethan. He'd thought her too shy for this kind of social performance, but apparently he'd underestimated her. He was starting to realize he'd underestimated quite a lot about Clara Dawson. Clara Cole now, he reminded himself. That was going to take some getting used to. The cake was cut, toasts were made, and through it all, Ethan felt like he was watching himself from outside his body. This couldn't be real. This couldn't be his life now. Any moment, he would wake up in his room above the saddle shop and discover this had all been a whiskey-fueled nightmare. But it wasn't a nightmare. It was real. And it was permanent. And when the sun started to sink toward the western ridges, Malcolm Dawson pulled Ethan aside with an expression that suggested the real reckoning was about to begin. "I have a house for you both," Malcolm said quietly, "on Cottonwood Lane, at the edge of town. It's nothing fancy, just 2 rooms, a kitchen, and a small barn. But it's yours. My wedding gift to Clara." Ethan stared at him. "You bought us a house?" "I've been saving for Clara's future," Malcolm replied. "Figured she'd need something when I'm gone. Might as well be now. The house is furnished with the basics. You two can move in tonight." He paused, his blue eyes boring into Ethan's. "And Mr. Cole, I know this marriage isn't what you wanted. I know you feel trapped. But that's my daughter, my only child. And if you hurt her, if you shame her or abandon her or treat her cruelly, you'll answer to me. Are we clear?" There was steel in Malcolm's voice, the kind of steel that said this man might be a shopkeeper, but he was also a father who would protect his child with everything he had. "I won't hurt her," Ethan said, and was surprised to realize he meant it. He might resent this situation. He might hate being trapped. But he wouldn't take it out on Clara. She was as much a victim of circumstances as he was. "I'll keep my word, Mr. Dawson. I'll be a husband to her. Maybe not the husband she deserves, but I won't abandon her or shame her." Malcolm studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "That'll have to be enough. Take care of her, Mr. Cole. She's stronger than she looks, but she's been lonely her whole life. Maybe you both have. Maybe that's something. Maybe it was. Or maybe it was just wishful thinking from a father who wanted to believe his daughter's forced marriage might somehow work out." As the reception wound down and twilight painted the sky in shades of purple and gold, Ethan found himself standing outside the church with Clara, both of them facing the reality of what came next. They had a house. They were married. They were supposed to go home together. Home. When had Ethan last had a home? Not a room he rented, not a bedroll under the stars, but an actual home. "Ready?" he asked Clara, offering his arm. She took it, her touch light, tentative. "As ready as I'll ever be." They walked through the streets of Coyote Ridge as the lamps were being lit, as the town settled into evening routines. People called out goodbyes and congratulations. Someone threw rice. Where they'd gotten rice in Coyote Ridge, Ethan had no idea. It felt surreal, like acting in a play where he didn't know his lines. Cottonwood Lane was at the eastern edge of town, where the buildings gave way to open land. 3 houses lined the lane, and the last one, the smallest, was theirs. It was a simple structure, weathered wood, a small porch, shutters that needed painting. Behind it stood a barn barely big enough for 2 horses and some hay, but it had a door with their names on it. Well, Ethan's name now that Clara had taken his. It had windows with curtains. It had a reality that made Ethan's chest tighten with something between panic and resignation. "Shall we?" Clara asked softly. Ethan opened the door. The interior was simple but clean. A main room with a stone fireplace, a table and chairs, a sofa that had seen better days. A kitchen area with a cast-iron stove and shelves stocked with basics. 2 doors led off the main room, one to a bedroom, one to what looked like a storeroom. Clara moved through the space slowly, touching things gently. The back of a chair, the mantel above the fireplace, the blue-checked curtains. "It's nice?" she said finally. "Father did well." Ethan stood awkwardly in the middle of the room, feeling like an intruder in this space that was supposed to be his home. "Clara, about the sleeping arrangements." "I'll take the storeroom," she said quickly, not looking at him. "There's space for a bed in there. You should have the bedroom. We don't need to." She trailed off, color flooding her cheeks, and Ethan understood what she was trying to say. Their marriage might be legal, but it didn't have to be real in the ways that mattered. They could maintain separate lives under the same roof. "Are you sure?" Ethan asked. "The storeroom will be small, cramped." "I'm used to small spaces," Clara replied. "I'll be fine. This is a business arrangement, Mr. Cole. We don't need to pretend otherwise." Mr. Cole. They were married, and she was still calling him Mr. Cole. "Ethan," he said, "if we're going to live together, you might as well call me Ethan." "Ethan," she repeated, tasting the name. "And you can call me Clara. I suppose we should at least be on first-name terms." "I suppose so." They stood there in the gathering darkness, 2 strangers wearing wedding rings, trying to figure out how to navigate this impossible situation. Finally, Clara moved toward the storeroom. "I should set up my space," she said. "Father had a bed delivered earlier. I'll be fine. You should rest. It's been a long day." "Clara?" Ethan called as she reached the door. She turned back. "I meant what I told your father. I won't hurt you. I won't abandon you. I may not be husband of the year, but I'll honor our agreement. You have my word." Something flickered in her dark eyes, gratitude maybe, or relief. "Thank you. That's all I can ask." She disappeared into the storeroom, closing the door softly behind her, and Ethan was left alone in what was now supposed to be his home. He sank onto the sofa, dropped his head into his hands, and tried to process what had just happened to his life. A week ago, he'd been a free man with no ties and no obligations. Now he was married, had a house, had a wife behind that closed door who'd looked at him with a mixture of fear and hope that made him feel like the worst kind of scoundrel. How had it come to this? All because of pride. All because he couldn't back down from a bet, couldn't admit defeat, couldn't let go of his reputation as a man of honor. Well, he was a man of honor now. Bound by vows he'd spoken in front of God and everyone. Shackled to a woman he barely knew for the rest of his natural life. The question was, what did he do now? Ethan sat there in the darkness of his new home, listening to the small sounds of Clara moving around in the storeroom, and tried to find an answer he didn't have. The first rays of sunlight came through the bedroom window like accusers, harsh and unforgiving. Ethan woke with a start. momentarily disoriented by the unfamiliar room, the unfamiliar bed, the weight of the gold band on his left hand that felt heavier than iron shackles. Then memory crashed back in full force, and he groaned, throwing his arm over his eyes as if he could block out reality along with the light. He was married. To Clara Dawson. No, Clara Cole now. The quiet girl with the dark eyes who was somewhere in this house right now, probably as miserable as he was. The smell of coffee drifted through the bedroom door, which he'd left slightly ajar. Ethan lay there for another moment, gathering his courage, then forced himself upright. His clothes from yesterday lay in a crumpled heap on the floor where he'd dropped them before collapsing into bed. He pulled on trousers and a shirt, ran his fingers through his hair in a half-hearted attempt at grooming, and emerged into the main room. Clara stood at the cast-iron stove, her back to him, wearing a simple gray dress that made her look like a shadow in the morning light. Her dark hair was already pinned up in that severe bun she always wore. She moved with quiet efficiency, pouring coffee into 2 tin cups, setting them on the table alongside a plate of biscuits that must have come from her father's store. "Good morning," she said without turning around, as if she had eyes in the back of her head. Her voice was neutral, carefully devoid of emotion. "Morning," Ethan replied, moving to the table. He sat down, wrapped his hands around the coffee cup, and let the warmth seep into his palms. The coffee was strong and bitter, the way he liked it, though he hadn't told her that. Maybe she'd just guessed, or maybe it was how she made it for herself. They sat in silence, drinking coffee and eating biscuits that turned to sawdust in Ethan's mouth. The awkwardness stretched between them like a physical thing, thick and suffocating. Every small sound seemed amplified, the scrape of a cup against wood, the creak of a chair, the whisper of Clara's dress as she shifted position. Finally, Ethan couldn't stand it anymore. "Did you sleep all right?" "Well enough," Clara replied, still not quite meeting his eyes. "The storeroom is adequate, did you?" "Fine." It was a lie. He'd tossed and turned half the night, his mind churning with resentment and regret and a dozen other emotions he didn't want to examine too closely. More silence. Ethan cleared his throat. "Listen, Clara, we need to figure out how this is going to work. We can't just sit here in uncomfortable silence for the rest of our lives." "I don't expect you to entertain me," Clara said quietly. "You're free to come and go as you please. I'll keep the house, prepare meals, do what's expected of a wife. You can maintain your usual routines. We don't need to spend time together beyond what's necessary for appearances." It was such a cold, businesslike speech that Ethan felt something twist in his chest. Was this really what his life had become? A marriage of pure convenience where 2 people shared a roof but nothing else? But what had he expected? Romance? Companionship? He barely knew this woman, and what he did know suggested they had absolutely nothing in common. She was quiet and domestic. He was loud and wild. She probably read books and did needlework. He played cards and got into bar fights. They were fundamentally incompatible, and the sooner they both accepted that, the easier this would be. "Fine," Ethan said, standing abruptly. "I'm going out. Need to check on my horse at the livery. Don't know when I'll be back." "All right." Clara began gathering the dishes, her movements precise and economical. "I'll have dinner ready at 6, if you're here." "If you're here." The words carried no accusation, no disappointment, just a simple statement of conditional reality. Somehow, that made it worse. Ethan grabbed his hat and gun belt from where he'd hung them by the door and escaped into the morning sunshine. He stood on the small porch, breathing deeply, trying to shake off the oppressive weight of that silent house and the woman who moved through it like a ghost. Coyote Ridge was coming to life around him. He could hear the sounds of the town waking up, hammers from the blacksmith shop, voices calling greetings, the jingle of harness as someone hitched up a wagon. Normal sounds. The world continuing as if nothing had changed, even though Ethan's entire life had been turned upside down. He walked toward the center of town, his boots kicking up small clouds of dust with each step. Every person he passed seemed to know about the wedding. Most called out congratulations with varying degrees of sincerity. Mrs. Henderson waved from her seamstress shop and called out something about hoping Clara was well. Pete Mallory gave him a knowing grin and a thumbs up that made Ethan want to punch him. The Lucky Star Saloon beckoned like an old friend. It was too early for serious drinking, barely past 8 in the morning, But Ethan pushed through the doors anyway, craving the familiar atmosphere, the sense of belonging he'd always found in saloons. Chester was wiping down tables, preparing for the day's business. He looked up when Ethan entered, and his weathered face broke into a grin. "Well, well, if it ain't our newlywed, how's married life treating you, Cole?" "Pour me a whiskey, Chester, and we'll call it even." "Whiskey at 8 in the morning? That good, huh?" But Chester moved behind the bar and poured a generous shot. "On the house. Consider it a wedding present." Ethan tossed back the whiskey, feeling the burn chase away some of the morning's discomfort. "Thanks. Pour another." "Easy there, friend. Day's just starting. Don't remind me." Ethan leaned against the bar, staring at his reflection in the mirror behind the bottles. He looked haggard, older than his 30 years. "You ever been married, Chester?" "Twice. First one died of fever back in Missouri. Second one ran off with a snake oil salesman." Chester poured himself a drink and raised his glass. "To marriage. May it be kinder to you than it was to me." They drank in companionable silence. Other regulars began filtering in, men with nothing better to do than start their day with a beer and conversation. Most of them wanted to talk about the wedding, to hear details, to offer advice that ranged from useless to actively terrible. Ethan endured it with as much grace as he could muster, which wasn't much. By noon, he was well on his way to drunk. The saloon had filled up with the lunch crowd, and a card game had started at his usual table. Ethan joined in automatically, his hands moving through the familiar rhythms of shuffle and deal while his mind drifted elsewhere. He kept thinking about Clara in that house. What was she doing right now? Cleaning? Cooking? Just sitting in silence, wondering what she'd gotten herself into? Did she regret it? Did she wish she'd told him to go to hell instead of agreeing to this farce? "Your bet, Cole," someone said, and Ethan realized he'd lost track of the game entirely. He folded his cards and pushed back from the table. "I'm out. Not feeling it today." Trouble in paradise already? Buck Morrison had entered the saloon at some point, and now he stood there with that same mean smile he'd worn when he'd made the bet that had ruined Ethan's life. "How's that little mouse of a wife treating you?" Ethan's hand went to his gun before he could stop himself, and Buck's smile widened. "Easy now, Cole. We're all friends here, just making conversation." "Make it somewhere else," Ethan growled. "You've done enough damage." "Damage? I gave you a wife. Most men would thank me." Buck moved to the bar, ordered a drink. "Though I'll admit I didn't think you'd actually go through with it. Thought you'd run for sure. Guess I underestimated your sense of honor, or your stupidity. Hard to tell which." Every word was like salt in an open wound. Ethan felt rage building in his chest, hot and dangerous. His fingers flexed near his gun, and the saloon went quiet as men recognized the signs of violence about to erupt. "Mr. Cole." The voice came from the doorway, soft but clear. Everyone turned. Clara stood in the entrance to the Lucky Star Saloon, looking impossibly small and out of place among the rough men and rougher atmosphere. She wore a shawl over her dress and carried a basket covered with a cloth. Her face was composed, but Ethan could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her knuckles were white where she gripped the basket handle. "Clara?" Ethan's hand dropped away from his gun. "What are you doing here?" "You forgot your lunch," she said simply, moving through the saloon with measured steps. Men parted for her like the Red Sea before Moses, their expressions ranging from surprise to amusement to something like respect. She reached Ethan and held out the basket. "I thought you might be hungry." Ethan took the basket automatically, too stunned to do otherwise. "You brought me lunch?" "Wives do that sometimes, I'm told." There was the faintest hint of something in her voice. Humor, maybe? Or irony? She glanced around the saloon, her gaze lingering on Buck Morrison for just a moment longer than the others. "I'll leave you to your friends. Dinner at 6, if you're there." She turned to leave, and Ethan found himself reaching out, catching her wrist gently. "Clara, wait. You didn't have to do this." "I know." She looked down at his hand on her wrist, then up at his face. "But you're my husband. People are watching. Let them see that we're making the best of this situation." She paused, and her voice dropped lower, meant only for him. "And you looked like you needed rescuing from your own anger. A man makes bad decisions when he's that angry." She'd seen it. Seen him on the verge of doing something stupid, something that would have ended in violence or worse. and she'd walked into a saloon, something respectable women simply didn't do, to pull him back from that edge. "Thank you," Ethan said quietly, releasing her wrist. Clara nodded, the ghost of a smile touching her lips. Then she walked back through the saloon, her head held high, and disappeared into the sunlight beyond the doors. The silence that followed was profound. Then Buck Morrison laughed, a harsh bark of sound. "Well, damn! Maybe that little mouse has some spine after all." "Shut up, Buck," Chester said from behind the bar. "Girls showed more courage walking in here than you've shown in your whole sorry life." Ethan sat down at an empty table and opened the basket. Inside he found fresh bread, cold chicken, an apple, and a slice of pie wrapped in paper. Simple food, but prepared with care. A note tucked under the pie read simply, "You looked like you needed this more than I did." See, he ate slowly, aware of eyes on him, aware of the story this would become. The story of how Clara Cole had walked into the Lucky Star Saloon and brought her husband lunch on their first full day of marriage. How she'd stood there calm and composed while hardened men stared and whispered. How she'd turned something that should have been humiliating into something almost dignified. The food was good, better than good. The bread was fresh and soft, the chicken seasoned with herbs he couldn't identify, the pie sweet and flaky. Clara could cook. That was something, at least, a practical skill that would make this arrangement more bearable. Ethan finished his meal, gathered the basket and napkin, and stood. He'd been planning to spend the entire day here, drinking until the edges of his reality blurred. But something had shifted. Clara had walked into his world, literally, and pulled him out. The least he could do was not throw that gesture back in her face by drinking himself into oblivion. "Heading out?" Chester asked as Ethan passed the bar. "Yeah, got things to do." It was vague, but Chester didn't press. Outside, the afternoon sun beat down with relentless intensity. Ethan stood on the boardwalk, basket in hand, trying to figure out what things to do actually meant. He'd spent 3 years in Coyote Ridge with no obligations beyond showing up for card games. Now he had a house, a wife, responsibilities he'd never wanted. He walked slowly back to Cottonwood Lane, his mind churning. The house looked the same as when he'd left it that morning, but somehow different now. Less like a trap. More like what? He couldn't quite articulate it. The door was unlocked. Ethan entered quietly, not sure what he'd find. Clara was in the kitchen area, her hands in a large bowl kneading dough. She looked up when he entered, flour dusting her cheeks. "You're back early," she observed, without judgment or surprise. "Yeah, well, seemed like a good day to try something different." Ethan set the basket on the table. "Thank you for lunch. It was good, really good." "You're welcome." She returned her attention to the dough, pressing and folding with practiced movements. "There's fresh water in the pitcher if you're thirsty." Ethan poured himself water from the earthenware pitcher, drank deeply, and tried to think of something to say. The silence was back, but it felt different now, less hostile. More like two people who didn't know each other but were trying to coexist in the same space. "That was brave," he said finally. "Coming to the saloon, women don't usually—" "I know what women usually do," Clara interrupted quietly. "But I'm not usual, am I? Never have been. The quiet girl, the strange one. Might as well add the woman who went to the saloon to the list of things people whisper about me." "You heard what Buck said about being a mouse." "I've heard worse." She shaped the dough into a loaf and set it in a pan to rise. "Words don't hurt me, Ethan. They're just air shaped into sounds. What hurts is other things. Like being forced to marry a gambler because he made a stupid bet." Clara wiped her hands on her apron and finally looked at him directly. "Like being invisible. Like knowing no one in this town has ever really seen me. I'm just Malcolm's quiet daughter, the spinster-to-be, someone to pity or ignore." She paused. "At least now I'm someone's wife. At least I exist in a way that matters to the world." "You matter," Ethan said, surprising himself with the sincerity in his voice. "You've always mattered. People just didn't see it." "Do you see it?" The question was direct, challenging. "Or am I just a burden you're stuck with?" Ethan thought about it, really thought about it, instead of just reacting with anger and resentment. He thought about her walking into the saloon. about her calm acceptance of an impossible situation, about the care she'd put into making him lunch, even though he'd given her nothing but coldness that morning. "I'm starting to," he admitted. "I'm starting to see that there's more to you than I thought." Something flickered in Clara's eyes. Surprise. Maybe relief. That's a start, I suppose. More than I expected on day one. "We have to start somewhere." Ethan pulled out a chair and sat at the table. "So tell me, who is Clara Cole? Who did I actually marry?" Clara studied him for a long moment, as if deciding whether he was serious. Finally, she poured herself a cup of water and sat down across from him. "I'm 23 years old. My mother died when I was 7, and I've been helping my father run the store ever since. I can read and write and do figures better than most men in this town. I like books. Have a whole shelf of them in the storeroom now. I can shoot a rifle better than I can sew, which isn't saying much because I'm terrible at sewing despite Mrs. Henderson's best efforts." She paused, took a sip of water. "I'm not as quiet as people think. I just don't waste words on conversations that don't matter. And I'm not as meek as I look. I've just learned that sometimes it's easier to let people underestimate you." Ethan found himself leaning forward, genuinely interested. "You can shoot?" "My father taught me. Said a woman running a store needed to know how to protect herself in the inventory. I'm good with a rifle. Decent with a pistol, though I prefer the rifle's range." A hint of pride crept into her voice. "Last year I hit a coyote at 100 yards, clean shot. Father was impressed." "Where'd you learn to cook?" "Books, mostly, and trial and error. Father's not picky, so he survived my early attempts." A ghost of a smile touched her lips. "I burned a lot of stew before I figured out how long to let things simmer." They talked through the afternoon, an awkward dance of question and answer that gradually became easier. Ethan found himself telling her things he hadn't planned to share, about growing up in St. Louis, about the gambling halls along the Mississippi where he'd learned cards, about drifting west after his parents died because there was nothing left to hold him. Clara listened more than she talked, but when she did speak, her words were thoughtful, considered. She asked good questions. She didn't judge. And slowly, tentatively, something that might eventually become understanding began to form between them. When the clock on the mantel struck 6, Clara stood and moved to the stove where dinner had been simmering. "Venison stew," she announced, "and the bread should be ready by now." The meal was excellent. They ate in companionable near silence, and Ethan realized that silence wasn't always uncomfortable. Sometimes it was just two people existing together without the need to fill every moment with noise. After dinner, Ethan helped with the dishes, something he'd never done before, but it seemed wrong to sit idle while Clara worked. She looked surprised but didn't comment, just handed him a towel for drying. "I should probably check on my horse tomorrow," Ethan said as they worked. "Make sure the livery is treating him right. You want to come with me?" Clara's hands paused in the wash water. "You're asking me to come with you?" "Well, yeah, I mean, if you want. Might be good for people to see us together. Make this marriage look more real." "Is that the only reason?" There was something careful in her voice. Ethan thought about lying, about claiming it was all for show, but something in Clara's direct gaze made him tell the truth. "No, I'm curious. Want to see you shoot that rifle you're so proud of. Livery's on the edge of town near where some folks practice. We could make an afternoon of it." Clara's smile was small but genuine. "I'd like that. Yes, let's do that." The days that followed fell into an uneasy rhythm. Ethan still spent time at the Lucky Star, but he found himself coming home earlier, drinking less, actually looking forward to Clara's dinners. She maintained the house with quiet efficiency, but she was also starting to add her own touches: curtains in the bedroom, a vase of wildflowers on the table, books stacked neatly on a shelf she'd claimed as her own. They were learning each other's patterns, habits, quirks. Ethan discovered that Clara sang softly to herself when she thought no one was listening, old songs her mother had taught her. Clara learned that Ethan had nightmares sometimes, waking with a gasp, and she started leaving a lamp burning low in the main room so he wouldn't wake to complete darkness. The town watched them with interest that bordered on obsession. Every interaction was scrutinized, every public appearance analyzed. Ethan and Clara gave them little to work with. They were polite to each other in public, walked together on Sundays, maintained the appearance of a functional, if not passionate, marriage. But the whispers continued. Bets were still being placed on when Ethan would run. People speculated about whether the marriage had been consummated, a topic that made Clara's cheeks burn when she overheard it at the general store. 2 weeks after the wedding, Ethan made good on his promise. They walked to the livery together on a Saturday afternoon, Clara carrying the rifle her father had given her years ago. It was a Winchester, well-maintained, the wood stock worn smooth from use. At the makeshift shooting range behind the livery, a few men were practicing. They looked up in surprise when Clara and Ethan approached, and Ethan could see the skepticism on their faces. A woman with a rifle was unusual enough. A woman claiming she could actually shoot was something else entirely. "Mind if we use the range?" Ethan asked casually. "Course not," said Jim Baker, who ran the livery. "You planning to shoot, Mrs. Cole?" "I am," Clara replied, her voice steady. She sat up at the line, checking her rifle with the ease of long practice. "What's your target?" Jim asked, clearly humoring her. Clara scanned the range, her eyes settling on a bottle someone had set on a fence post about 75 yards away. "That bottle," Jim chuckled. "That's a tough shot, ma'am, even for experienced shooters." Clara didn't respond. She simply raised the rifle, sighted down the barrel, breathed out slowly, and squeezed the trigger. The shot cracked across the range, and the bottle exploded into fragments. The silence that followed was absolute. Jim's mouth hung open. The other men stared. Ethan found himself grinning. "Another?" Clara asked, her tone neutral but with just a hint of satisfaction. They set up more targets. Clara hit them all, bottles at varying distances, a playing card tacked to a post, even a tin can someone tossed in the air at her request. With each shot, her confidence grew, and Ethan watched as the quiet woman he'd married transformed into someone else entirely. Someone fierce and focused and undeniably skilled. When she finally lowered the rifle, Jim Baker let out a low whistle. "Mrs. Cole, that's some of the finest shooting I've ever seen. Where'd you learn?" "My father," Clara said simply. "He's a patient teacher." Word spread through Coyote Ridge like wildfire. By Sunday morning, everyone knew that Clara Cole could shoot like a frontier sharpshooter. The whispers changed. Now people weren't just talking about the forced marriage or speculating on when Ethan would run. They were talking about Clara herself, about her skill, her nerve, the fact that she'd been hiding such talent all along. At church that Sunday, Mrs. Henderson pulled Clara aside. "My dear, I had no idea you were so accomplished. You've been hiding your light under a bushel all these years." Clara smiled politely. "I never thought it was particularly interesting, Mrs. Henderson. Just a skill my father taught me." But Ethan could see the change. Clara stood a little straighter now, spoke a little more freely. The town's perception had shifted, and with it, Clara's perception of herself. She was no longer just the quiet shopkeeper's daughter. She was the woman who could shoot better than most men. That evening, as they sat on their small porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and red, Ethan felt something unfamiliar stirring in his chest. It wasn't love. He wasn't fool enough to call it that. But it was something. Respect, maybe. Interest. A dawning realization that the woman he'd been forced to marry was far more complex and capable than he'd ever imagined. "Thank you," Clara said softly, breaking the comfortable silence. "For what?" "For taking me to the range, for giving me a chance to show what I can do, for not being ashamed of having a wife who shoots." "Ashamed? Clara, I was proud." The words came out before Ethan could stop them, but he realized they were true. "You showed them all. Showed me too, if I'm being honest." Clara turned to look at him, and in the fading light, her eyes were soft. "You're not what I expected either. I thought you'd resent me every day. Thought you'd spend all your time at the saloon, avoiding this house and everything in it. But you keep coming home. You talk to me. You're trying." "So are you." "So are we both," she paused. "Maybe that's enough. Maybe we don't need passion or romance. Maybe just trying is sufficient." Ethan wanted to agree, wanted to say that yes, just getting along was enough, that they could build a perfectly adequate life on mutual respect and shared space. But looking at Claire in that moment, her profile silhouetted against the dying light, her expression peaceful, he found himself wondering if enough was really what he wanted. The thought scared him. He'd spent weeks resenting this marriage, planning his emotional escape even while his honor kept him physically present. Now, without quite realizing how it had happened, he was starting to care, starting to see Clara as more than an obligation, starting to imagine that maybe this forced marriage could become something more. But he wasn't ready to say any of that aloud, wasn't ready to be that vulnerable. So instead he just nodded and said, "Yeah, it's enough." 3 weeks into their marriage, disaster came from an unexpected direction. Ethan had fallen back into some of his old patterns, spending afternoons at the Lucky Star, playing cards, drinking more than he probably should. He wasn't drunk every night, but he was drinking enough that Clara noticed, though she never said anything about it. One evening, Ethan came home well past dinner time, his steps unsteady, whiskey on his breath. He'd lost badly at cards, not enough to hurt financially, but enough to wound his pride. And pride, as always, made him stupid. Clara was in the small garden plot beside the house, watering the vegetables she'd planted the week before. She'd been working on that garden every evening, carefully tending the young plants, talking to them softly as if they could hear her encouragement. Ethan stood on the porch, watching her work, and something ugly twisted inside him. The garden represented stability, permanence, a future in Coyote Ridge that he'd never planned for, never wanted. And right now, with whiskey clouding his judgment and anger burning in his gut, he hated it. "What's the point?" he called out, his words slightly slurred. "What's the point of planting a garden when I'll probably be gone before harvest?" Clara straightened, turned to face him. "Are you planning to leave?" "Maybe. Maybe I will. This whole situation, this house, this marriage, this life, it's not what I wanted, never wanted to be tied down." "Then go." Clara's voice was quiet but steady. "I never asked you to stay. Never asked you to care. If you want to run, the door's right there." "Don't tempt me." Ethan stumbled down the porch steps, suddenly furious at her calmness, her composure, her ability to remain unshaken while he felt like he was drowning. "You and your father, you trapped me. Used my own honor against me. And for what? So you could have a husband? So you wouldn't die an old maid?" Color flooded Clara's cheeks, but her voice remained level. "Go inside, Ethan. You're drunk." "I'm not that drunk. Not too drunk to see the truth. We're living a lie, Clara. Playing house, pretending this means something when it doesn't. When it never will." "Then what do you want?" Clara set down her watering can and stepped closer, and now there was fire in her eyes. "You want me to release you from our vows? I can't do that. You want me to stop trying to make this house a home? Fine. I'll stop. You want me to just disappear, to not exist so you can pretend you're still free? Tell me, Ethan, what do you want?" "I don't know." The words burst out of him, raw and honest. "I don't know what I want anymore. I'm angry all the time and I don't even know why. Angry at Buck for making that bet. Angry at myself for taking it. Angry at you for being so damn reasonable about everything. Don't you ever get angry? Don't you ever just want to scream?" "Every day," Clara said, and her voice cracked. "Every single day I'm angry. At my life. At this town. At every person who looked through me like I didn't exist. At you, for making me hope this could be more than just an arrangement. Yes, I'm angry, Ethan, but I don't take it out on innocent plants." Before Ethan quite knew what he was doing, he'd kicked over the watering can, sending water spilling across the garden. Then, in a moment of pure, destructive stupidity fueled by whiskey and rage, he stomped through the garden, crushing plants beneath his boots, destroying weeks of Clara's careful work in seconds. The moment the anger passed, shame crashed over him like a wave. He stood in the ruins of the garden, breathing hard, and looked up to see Clara's face. She wasn't crying. That might have been easier. Instead, she just looked at him with an expression that was part disappointment, part pity, part something he couldn't quite name. "I'm sorry," Ethan said, the words pathetically inadequate. "Clara, I'm so sorry. I don't know what—" "Get out." Her voice was soft but absolute. "Get out of my sight. Go back to your saloon, your cards, your whiskey. Go be the man everyone thought you were. The one who destroys things because he can't stand to watch them grow." "Clara. Now, Ethan, leave now before I—" She stopped, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. "Just go." Ethan wanted to argue, wanted to explain, wanted to somehow make this right. But he could see in her face that there was nothing he could say. Not now. Not when he'd just destroyed something she'd created with her own hands, her own hope for a future in this impossible situation. He walked past her, heading not toward the house, but toward town, toward the saloon, toward the familiar comfort of whiskey and cards and men who expected nothing from him but a good game and bad jokes. Behind him, he heard Clara move. Not crying, not calling after him, just the quiet sound of her kneeling in the ruined garden, trying to salvage what could be saved. And Ethan kept walking because he was a coward and a fool, and because facing what he'd done was more than he could manage in that moment. He would regret that walk for a long time. Ethan spent that night at the Lucky Star, drinking until Chester finally cut him off and told him to sleep it off in the back room where they kept surplus inventory. He woke the next morning on a pile of grain sacks, his head pounding, his mouth tasting like something had died in it, and his shame so heavy he could barely stand under the weight of it. What had he done? What kind of man destroyed a garden, destroyed anything, just because he was angry and drunk and unable to deal with his own feelings? Clara had been right to throw him out. She should have done more, should have picked up that rifle of hers and run him off permanently. He dragged himself upright, wincing as every movement sent fresh waves of pain through his skull. Through the small window, he could see that the sun was already high. Late morning, maybe close to noon. He'd lost half a day to whiskey and stupidity. Chester found him sitting on the grain sacks, head in his hands. "You look like hell, Cole. And you smell worse. There's a pump out back if you want to clean up." "Thanks," Ethan managed, his voice rough as gravel. "You want to talk about whatever drove you to drink like that? Because I've been pouring whiskey for 20 years, and I know the difference between a man having a good time and a man trying to drown something." Ethan looked up at Chester's weathered face, at the concern in his eyes, and felt his throat tighten. "I destroyed her garden. Clara planted this garden, spent weeks caring for it, and I got drunk and angry and just destroyed it, stomped through it like a child having a tantrum." Chester let out a low whistle. "That's bad, son. That's real bad." "I know, believe me. I know." Ethan stood, swaying slightly. "I need to go home. Need to apologize. Need to fix this somehow." "You do that. And Cole," Chester's voice stopped him at the door. "That woman of yours, she's special. Don't know if you figured that out yet, but she is. Don't lose her because you're too damn stubborn to deal with your own mess." Ethan nodded and pushed out into the harsh sunlight. The walk back to Cottonwood Lane felt like miles instead of blocks. Each step was a reminder of his failure, his cruelty, his inability to be the man Clara deserved. The house looked the same from the outside, but Ethan felt like he was approaching a fortress. He stood on the porch for a long moment, gathering his courage before finally opening the door. The main room was empty. Everything was neat and clean, just as Clara always kept it, but there was a coldness to the space that hadn't been there before. The bedroom door stood open, also empty. That left only the storeroom where Clara slept. Ethan knocked softly on that closed door. "Clara, I'm back. I need to talk to you." Silence. Then, finally, her voice muffled by the door. "Go away, Ethan. Please, I need to apologize. Need to explain. There's nothing to explain. You were drunk. You were angry. You destroyed something I cared about. What more is there to say? Let me make it right. Let me fix the garden. Replace the plants." The door opened abruptly. Clara stood there in the same dress she'd worn yesterday, her hair slightly disheveled, her eyes red-rimmed but dry. She looked exhausted, like she hadn't slept at all. "You can't fix it," she said flatly. "Those plants are dead, gone, and fixing the garden won't fix what's actually broken here." "Then tell me what will. Tell me how to make this right." Clara laughed, but there was no humor in it. "I don't know, Ethan. I don't know if anything can make this right. I've tried to be understanding, tried to give you space, tried to make this arrangement work despite neither of us wanting it. But last night you showed me who you really are when things get hard. You run, you drink, you destroy things, and I can't live like that. I won't." You're right. The words came out before Ethan could stop them. You're absolutely right. I ran. I drank. I destroyed something you created because I was too much of a coward to deal with my own feelings. But Clara, please, I'm asking you, give me one more chance. Let me prove I can be better than that. Why should I? Her voice was quiet but sharp. Give me one good reason why I should believe anything will change. Ethan opened his mouth and then closed it again. What could he say? What promise could he make that would mean anything after last night? Finally, he just said the truth. Because I don't want to be the man I was last night. Because when I woke up this morning and realized what I'd done, I hated myself more than I've ever hated anything. Because you deserve better, and I want to be better, even if I don't know how yet. Clara studied his face for a long moment, and Ethan forced himself to meet her gaze, to let her see the shame and regret and desperate hope he was feeling. One chance, she said finally. One more chance, Ethan. But if you do something like that again, if you let anger and whiskey turn you into someone cruel, I will leave. I don't care what the town thinks. I don't care about vows or reputation or anything else. I will walk out that door and not look back. Are we clear? Crystal clear? Good. She moved past him into the main room. There's coffee on the stove. It's cold, but it's there. I'm going to my father's store. I need to be somewhere else for a while. Clara, I'll be back for dinner. We can talk more then. But right now, I need space. She grabbed her shawl and walked out, leaving Ethan standing in the middle of the room, feeling like he'd just narrowly avoided a disaster he'd brought entirely on himself. The days that followed were tense and careful. Clara maintained a polite distance, speaking to Ethan only when necessary, her words clipped and formal. Ethan, for his part, stayed sober. He went to the Lucky Star but drank only coffee. He came home for meals. He tried to help around the house, though Clara often waved him away, preferring to do things herself. The garden remained a patch of destroyed earth, a monument to Ethan's failure. He wanted to fix it, but Clara had asked him not to touch it, and he respected that wish even though it meant walking past his shame every day. A week after the incident, the weather began to change. The relentless heat that had defined the summer started to break, and clouds gathered on the western horizon, dark, heavy clouds that promised rain. In Arizona, where rain was precious and storms were rare, this was cause for both celebration and concern. The land needed water desperately, but storms in the territory could be violent and destructive. By Thursday afternoon, the clouds had moved closer, and the air held that strange electric quality that preceded major weather. Ethan stood on the porch, watching the sky darken, feeling the wind pick up. It smelled like rain and ozone and change. Clara came out to stand beside him, and for a moment they just watched the approaching storm together in silence. This could be bad, Ethan said finally. Storm this big, coming this fast. We should prepare. What do we need to do? Clara's voice held no warmth, but she was at least asking him, acknowledging that they needed to work together. Secure anything outside that could blow away. Make sure the shutters are tight. Fill every container we have with water in case the well gets contaminated. Check the roof for weak spots where rain might come through. Ethan glanced at her. You ever been through a bad storm? Not since I was a child. I remember my mother securing everything, bringing me inside, holding me while the wind howled. After she died, Father and I just endured them. Together. The word together hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. They might be angry at each other, might be navigating an impossible marriage, but right now they needed to work together to survive what was coming. They spent the next hour preparing. Ethan brought in anything loose from outside, tools, the watering can Clara had saved from the garden disaster, a chair that sat on the porch. Clara filled every pot, pan, and bucket with water from the pump. They checked the shutters, found 2 that were loose, and Ethan hammered them secure while the wind tried to tear the hammer from his hand. By the time they finished, the storm was nearly upon them. The sky had turned an ominous greenish black, and lightning flickered in the distance, followed by thunder that sounded like the world splitting open. They retreated inside just as the first fat raindrops began to fall. Within minutes, those drops became a deluge, rain hammering against the roof and walls with a force that made conversation nearly impossible. The wind picked up, howling around the corners of the house like a living thing. The shutters rattled despite Ethan's repairs. Something outside crashed, something wooden and substantial. And Clara flinched, moving instinctively closer to Ethan before catching herself and stepping back. "The barn," Ethan said, having to shout to be heard over the storm. "That sounded like part of the barn. Can we check?" "Not in this. We'd be blown away or struck by lightning before we got halfway there." Ethan moved to the window, peering through a gap in the shutters. "All we can do is wait it out." The storm raged for hours. Rain pounded the roof so hard that Ethan worried it would cave in. Wind screamed and tore at everything. Lightning struck somewhere close, the thunder simultaneous and deafening, making Clara cry out and cover her ears. Around midnight, part of the roof began to leak. Water dripped steadily into the main room, forming a puddle on the floor. Ethan and Clara worked together to position buckets to catch the worst of it, to move furniture away from the leak, to try to minimize the damage. They were both soaked within minutes, water running down their faces, their clothes plastered to their bodies. But they kept working, kept moving, kept fighting against the storm's attempts to destroy their home. At some point, Ethan couldn't say exactly when, the nature of their cooperation shifted. They stopped being two separate people forced to work together and became a team. Clara would anticipate what Ethan needed and hand it to him before he asked. Ethan would steady a bucket while Clara positioned it, their movements synchronized without discussion. When a shutter finally tore loose and crashed inward, they both jumped to secure it, their hands working together to wrestle it back into place and hold it there while Ethan drove nails through the wood to keep it closed. "Hold it steady!" Ethan shouted over the wind and rain pouring through the open window. "I've got it!" Clara braced herself against the shutter, her whole body pressed against the wood while Ethan hammered. A nail bent and he cursed, throwing it aside, grabbing another. The wind was trying to rip the shutter out of Clara's hands, but she held firm, her face set in determined concentration. Finally, the last nail went in, and the shutter held. They collapsed back, breathing hard, staring at each other in the dim light of the single lamp still burning. Clara's hair had come completely loose from its bun and hung in wet ropes around her face. Her dress was soaked through, clinging to her in a way that made Ethan sharply aware of her as a woman, rather than just his wife in name only. Her chest heaved as she caught her breath, and there was color high on her cheeks from exertion and adrenaline. "You okay?" Ethan asked. "Fine. You?" "I'll live." He looked around the room, at the buckets catching water, at the puddles on the floor, at the chaos the storm had created inside their home. "Thank you for helping. I couldn't have done this alone." "Neither could I." Clara pushed wet hair back from her face. "I suppose that's something. At least we can survive a storm together." There was meaning underneath her words, and Ethan heard it clearly. They could survive a storm together, but could they survive the calmer days? Could they navigate the ordinary moments of a marriage without destroying each other? The storm finally began to ease around 3 in the morning. The wind died down to gusts instead of howls. The rain lessened from a deluge to a steady drumming. The worst had passed. Claire and Ethan sat together on the sofa, both exhausted, both still damp, watching the leak in the roof slow to an occasional drip. The lamp was burning low, casting strange shadows on the walls. "I need to say something," Ethan said quietly. "About the garden, about last night, about all of this." Clara didn't respond, but she didn't leave either, so Ethan continued. "When I made that bet, when I agreed to marry you, I thought my life was over, thought I was being trapped, caged, forced into something that would kill who I was. And I've been angry about it every day since. Angry at Buck, angry at myself, angry at you even though you didn't do anything wrong. That anger built up until I couldn't contain it anymore, and I took it out on your garden because that felt safer than admitting what I was really angry about." "Which was?" Clara's voice was barely audible over the rain. "I was angry at myself for starting to care, for starting to see this marriage as something real instead of just an obligation, for starting to imagine a future here with you in this house." Ethan turned to look at her. "Because that terrifies me, Clara. The thought of staying in one place, of being responsible to someone other than myself, of actually building a life instead of just drifting through one, it scares me more than anything I've ever faced." Clara met his gaze, her dark eyes unreadable in the lamplight. "And now? After tonight?" Now I realize that being scared isn't a good enough reason to destroy something, isn't a good enough reason to hurt you. You didn't ask for this marriage any more than I did, but you've been trying to make it work. You've been brave enough to plant a garden, to imagine a future. And I destroyed that because I was too much of a coward to do the same. I planted that garden because I needed to believe in something, Clara said softly. Needed to believe that life could take root even in hard soil, that with enough care and attention, something beautiful could grow. But you showed me how fragile that belief is, how easily it can be destroyed. Let me help you replant it. Ethan shifted to face her fully. Let me help you build something again. And this time, I promise, I swear, I won't destroy it. Not when I'm angry, not when I'm scared, not ever. Clara studied his face for a long moment. You hurt me, Ethan, really hurt me. Not just by destroying the garden, but by showing me that you see this marriage, this life, as a trap instead of a possibility. I know, and I'm sorry, more sorry than I know how to say. Sorry isn't enough. I need to know that you're committed to trying, not just to surviving this marriage, but to actually building something with me. Can you do that? Ethan thought about it, really thought about it. Could he commit to staying, to building a life in Coyote Ridge, to being a husband instead of just a man who happened to be married? The old Ethan, the one who'd ridden into town 3 years ago with nothing but a horse and a gun, would have said no, would have run. But that Ethan was fading, being replaced by someone new. Someone who'd spent a night fighting a storm beside a woman who was stronger than she looked. Someone who was starting to understand that freedom and responsibility weren't opposites, but could coexist. Yes, he said finally, I can do that. I want to do that. Then we have a foundation, Clara said. It's not much, but it's something. We can build on it. Together? Together. They sat there as the storm finally passed, as the rain became a drizzle and then stopped entirely, as the sky began to lighten with the approach of dawn. They didn't touch, didn't embrace, but there was something new between them, something fragile but real, a possibility that maybe this marriage could become more than just an arrangement. Dawn broke gray and cool, the air washed clean by the storm. Ethan and Clara finally stood, their bodies stiff from exhaustion, and surveyed the damage inside the house. Water stains on the floor, puddles to be mopped up, the leak in the roof that would need repair. But the house had held, they had survived. Outside, the damage was more extensive. Part of the barn's roof had collapsed, just as Ethan had suspected. The garden, what remained of it, was now a muddy ruin, though whether that was from the storm or Ethan's earlier destruction was impossible to say. Fence posts were down, debris was scattered everywhere. It'll take days to clean this up, Clara said, standing beside Ethan on the porch. Then we'd better get started. They worked through that morning and into the afternoon, stopping only briefly to eat cold biscuits and drink water. The whole town was dealing with storm damage. Roofs torn off, fences destroyed, one of the storefronts on Main Street partially collapsed. But Ethan and Clara focused on their own home, their own repairs, working side by side in a silence that was companionable rather than hostile. Around mid-afternoon, Malcolm Dawson arrived with a wagon full of supplies, lumber for repairs, nails, shingles for the roof. Heard you two took some damage, he said, climbing down from the wagon. Thought you might need help. Thank you, sir, Ethan said, genuinely grateful. We can use all the help we can get. Malcolm eyed his daughter, taking in her muddy dress, her exhausted face, the way she stood close to Ethan in a way she hadn't before. You two all right? Not just the house, but... He gestured vaguely, clearly asking about their marriage. We're working on it, Clara said simply. The storm helped, gave us something to fight together instead of fighting each other. Malcolm smiled. Storms have a way of doing that, putting things in perspective, making you realize what matters. The three of them worked together through the afternoon, repairing what could be repaired, making plans for what would need more extensive work. By the time the sun began to set, the barn had a temporary roof. The worst of the debris was cleared, and the leak in the house had been patched. Malcolm left as twilight fell, and Ethan and Clara were alone again. They stood in the kitchen, both filthy and exhausted, looking at each other across the space. I'll heat water for washing, Clara said. We both need it. I can do that. You should rest. Ethan. She stopped him with a hand on his arm. We're partners now. We do things together. That's what today taught me. What last night taught me. We're stronger together than apart. Partners, Ethan repeated, testing the word. It felt right. Better than spouses. Better than husband and wife with all the expectations those words carried. Partners suggested equality, cooperation, mutual respect. Partners, Clara confirmed, if that's acceptable to you. It's more than acceptable. Ethan covered her hand with his own, a brief touch, then released her. Let's get cleaned up. Tomorrow we can start rebuilding the garden. Together this time. That night, Clara didn't retreat to her storeroom immediately after dinner. Instead, she sat with Ethan at the table, and they talked, really talked, about their plans for the house, for the garden, for their life together. It wasn't romantic, it wasn't passionate, but it was real. Two people learning to navigate a relationship neither had chosen, but both were beginning to invest in. 3 days after the storm, on a bright Sunday morning, Ethan and Clara were working in the garden plot when riders appeared on the horizon. 5 men, moving fast, kicking up dust as they approached Cottonwood Lane. Ethan straightened, his hand instinctively moving toward his hip where his gun belt hung. He'd stopped wearing it constantly around the house, but old habits died hard, and right now those instincts were screaming danger. Go inside, he told Clara quietly. What is it? Don't know yet. But 5 men riding hard toward a house usually means trouble. Get inside, and if shooting starts, stay down. For once, Clara didn't argue. She moved quickly toward the house, but Ethan noticed she didn't go all the way in. She stood in the doorway, watching, and he couldn't blame her for wanting to know what was happening. The riders pulled up in front of the house, their horses snorting and stamping. Ethan recognized the lead man, Jake Thornton, an outlaw he'd had a run-in with 2 years ago over a card game that had ended badly. The men with him had the hard look of hired guns, men who killed for money and didn't ask questions. Ethan Cole, Jake said, his voice carrying across the yard. Been looking for you? Jake, thought you were in New Mexico. Was. Came back specifically to settle our business. Jake's hand rested on his gun. You remember that game, Cole? The one where you accused me of cheating. You were cheating. I caught you with marked cards. You humiliated me in front of half of Coyote Ridge, made me out to be a cheat and a liar. Nobody crosses Jake Thornton like that and lives to talk about it. Ethan's mind raced. He was good with a gun, very good, but he was 1 man against 5. Even if he took down Jake and maybe one other, the remaining 3 would kill him, and Clara was standing right there in the doorway where a stray bullet could easily find her. This doesn't have to happen, Jake, Ethan said, keeping his voice level. That game was 2 years ago. Water under the bridge. Not for me. I've been thinking about this for 2 years, thinking about making you pay. From the doorway, Clara spoke, her voice clear and steady. Mr. Thornton, I suggest you and your men ride out of here. Now, while you still can. All 5 men turned to look at her, and Jake laughed. Who's this? Your little wife, Cole? The one you got saddled with because of that card game? Heard about that. Whole territory heard about it. The great Ethan Cole, trapped by his own pride. Leave her out of this, Ethan growled. Or what? You gonna shoot all 5 of us? You're good, Cole, but you ain't that good. He doesn't have to be. Clara stepped out of the doorway, and Ethan's heart stopped because she was holding her Winchester, and it was pointed directly at Jake Thornton. I'll take the man on the left. Ethan will take you. That leaves 3, and I like those odds better. The casual confidence in her voice was startling. Jake's smile faltered. Lady, you don't want to get involved in this. I'm already involved. This is my home, my husband, and you're trespassing on my property, threatening my family. So here's what's going to happen. You're going to turn those horses around and ride out, or we're going to start shooting, and I promise you at least 2 of you won't make it out of this yard alive. She's bluffing, one of Jake's men muttered. Clara shifted her aim and fired. The bullet struck a rock 6 inches from the speaker's horse, sending up a spray of dust and stone fragments. The horse reared, nearly throwing its rider. When it came down, Clara had already chambered another round and had her rifle trained back on Jake. That was a warning, she said calmly. The next one won't be. The yard fell silent. Ethan could see the calculation happening in Jake's eyes. He'd come here expecting to face one man. Now he was facing two, one of whom had just demonstrated she could shoot and wasn't afraid to do it. The odds had shifted. "This ain't over, Cole," Jake said finally, pulling his horse's head around. "Not by a long shot." "Yes, it is," Ethan replied. "You ride away now, Jake, and it's over. You come back, and next time she won't miss. Neither will I. Your choice, but choose now." Jake stared at them for another long moment, then spat in the dust. "Let's go, boys. These two ain't worth the trouble." The 5 men rode out, disappearing back toward the ridge in a cloud of dust. Ethan and Clara stood frozen until they were completely out of sight. Then Ethan let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "Clara." He turned to her, and his hands were shaking with released tension. "That was either the bravest or the stupidest thing I've ever seen." "It worked, didn't it?" She lowered the rifle, and now he could see that she was shaking too. "I heard everything. Heard him threaten you. Heard him talk about killing you, and I thought if I stayed inside like you told me to, I'd be a widow before sundown, so I came out. You could have been killed. So could you." Clara met his eyes. "We're partners, remember? That means we face danger together. We protect each other. That's what marriage means, Ethan. Not just sharing a house or a name, but actually standing together when it matters." Ethan stepped forward and pulled her into his arms before he could think about whether it was appropriate or wanted. Clara stiffened for just a second, then melted against him, her face pressed against his chest, the rifle still clutched in one hand. They stood there in the yard holding each other, both trembling from adrenaline and relief and the simple fact of being alive. "Thank you," Ethan murmured into her hair. "Thank you for saving my life." "Thank you for being worth saving," Clara replied, her voice muffled against his shirt. When they finally pulled apart, something fundamental had changed between them. Ethan could see it in Clara's eyes, could feel it in the way she looked at him. They'd fought a storm together. They'd faced down armed men together. They'd proven to themselves and each other that their partnership was real, that it meant something beyond just legal obligation. "This isn't a mistake anymore," Ethan said quietly, echoing the words he'd thought but never spoken. "This marriage, us, it's not a mistake." Clara's smile was small but genuine, reaching her eyes for the first time since he'd known her. "No, it's not a mistake, it's a choice, and I'm choosing to make it work. Are you?" "Yeah," Ethan said, and meant it completely. "Yeah, I am." They walked back to the house together, and for the first time, Ethan took Clara's hand in his. It was a small gesture, simple and uncomplicated, but it meant everything. It meant he was choosing her, choosing this life, choosing to stop running and start building. And Clara squeezed his hand back, telling him without words that she was making the same choice, that they were in this together now, for better or worse, through storms and threats, and whatever else life in Coyote Ridge might throw at them. The bet that had brought them together might have been a joke, a cruel twist of fate. But what they were building now was no joke. It was real. It was theirs. And it was just beginning. News of Clara Cole's stand against Jake Thornton and his men spread through Coyote Ridge faster than wildfire through dry grass. By Monday morning, everyone in town was talking about how the quiet shopkeeper's daughter had faced down 5 armed outlaws with nothing but a rifle and nerves of steel. The story grew with each telling. Some versions had Clara shooting the gun out of Jake's hand. Others had her standing on the porch, delivering a speech about justice and honor that would have made a preacher weep. The truth was dramatic enough without embellishment, but truth rarely stopped a good story from getting better in the telling. By the time Ethan and Clara walked into town that afternoon to purchase supplies for rebuilding the barn, they were met with a reception neither had anticipated. Mrs. Henderson rushed out of her seamstress shop and practically threw her arms around Clara. "My dear girl, we heard what you did. Standing up to those horrible men. You're a heroine." I just protected my home," Clara said, clearly uncomfortable with the attention. "Anyone would have done the same." "Anyone would have hidden and prayed," Mrs. Henderson corrected. "You stood and fought. There's a difference, and everyone in this town knows it." More people gathered as word spread that the Coles were in town. Men tipped their hats to Clara with new respect in their eyes. Women who'd barely acknowledged her existence before now wanted to hear every detail of the confrontation. Children stared at her like she was something from a dime novel, a frontier woman who could shoot like Annie Oakley. At the general store, Malcolm Dawson stood behind the counter with barely contained pride. "There's my girl," he said as they entered. "Heard you gave Jake Thornton something to think about." "You raised her right, sir," Ethan said, and he meant it. "She saved my life yesterday." "Seems like you two have been doing a lot of that lately," Malcolm observed, pulling items off the shelves as Clara read from her list. "Saving each other. That's what marriage is supposed to be about." Clara's cheeks colored slightly, but she didn't contradict him. Ethan found himself standing a little closer to her, his hand occasionally brushing hers as they sorted through supplies, and neither of them pulled away from the contact. They were loading their purchases into a borrowed wagon when Buck Morrison appeared, his usual swagger somewhat diminished. He stood a few feet away, shifting his weight from foot to foot, clearly wanting to say something but struggling to find the words. "Buck," Ethan said neutrally, making no effort to help him. "Cole. Mrs. Cole." Buck pulled off his hat, turning it in his hands. "I heard about what happened yesterday. Wanted to say I'm glad you're both all right." "That's kind of you," Clara replied, her voice cool but polite. "And I wanted to say I'm sorry." The words came out in a rush, like Buck had been practicing them. "For the bet. For putting you both in this position. I was drunk and mean and thought I was being funny, but I wasn't. I was being cruel, and you two didn't deserve that." Ethan studied Buck's face, looking for signs of mockery or insincerity, but found none. The man looked genuinely ashamed, and that was something Ethan had never expected to see. "We didn't deserve it," Ethan agreed, "but maybe we needed it. Sometimes the worst things lead to the best outcomes, even if we can't see it at the time." Buck blinked, clearly surprised by the response. "So you're saying it worked out, the marriage?" "It's working out," Clara corrected gently. "We're working on it, together. That's all any marriage is, really. Two people choosing each other every day." "Well," Buck settled his hat back on his head, looking like a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. "I'm glad. Real glad. And if you two ever need anything at all, you just ask. Consider it my way of making amends." He walked away before either of them could respond, leaving Ethan and Clara staring after him in surprise. "Did Buck Morrison just apologize?" Clara asked, sounding almost as shocked as Ethan felt. "I think he did. Wonders never cease." Ethan climbed up onto the wagon seat and offered Clara his hand to help her up. She took it without hesitation, settling beside him close enough that their shoulders touched. "Ready to go home?" "Home," Clara repeated, testing the word. "Yes, I'm ready." The ride back to Cottonwood Lane was quiet, but it was the comfortable silence of two people who'd learned they didn't need to fill every moment with words. The afternoon sun painted the landscape in shades of gold and amber, and the air smelled clean from the recent rain. Ethan found himself thinking that Arizona in autumn might be the most beautiful place on earth, and for the first time since arriving in Coyote Ridge, he wasn't planning his next destination. Over the following weeks, life settled into a new rhythm. Ethan still went to the Lucky Star, but he played cards for pleasure rather than desperation, drank in moderation rather than excess, and always came home before midnight. Clara continued her work helping her father at the store 3 mornings a week, but she spent her afternoons transforming their house into a home, adding curtains, arranging furniture, planting a new garden with Ethan's help this time. They worked on that garden together, side by side in the cooling autumn weather. Ethan learned the names of vegetables he'd only ever seen on plates. Clara taught him about companion planting, about how certain plants helped each other grow stronger. It seemed like a metaphor for their marriage, though neither of them said it aloud. "The tomatoes need to go here," Clara explained one afternoon, marking spots in the freshly turned earth, "and the beans alongside them. The beans fix nitrogen in the soil, which helps the tomatoes grow." "So they help each other," Ethan said, kneeling beside her to dig the holes she'd marked. "Exactly. Alone, each plant would struggle more. Together, they thrive." Clara glanced at him, and there was something knowing in her smile. "Funny how nature works that way." "Real funny," Ethan agreed, returning her smile. They planted that garden with care, both of them understanding that this time it meant something different. This wasn't Clara's garden or Ethan's garden. It was theirs. A shared project. A promise that they were both staying, both investing in a future together. As they worked, they talked. Really talked. Ethan told Clara about his childhood in St. Louis, about parents who'd loved him but died too young, about the loneliness that had driven him west. Clara shared memories of her mother, of learning to run the store when she was barely tall enough to reach the counter, of the isolation of being different in a small town where different was rarely celebrated. "I was always too quiet," Clara said, patting soil around a tomato plant. "People thought I was simple, or strange, or just painfully shy. But the truth was, I just didn't have anything to say to most of them. Their conversations felt shallow, their concerns seemed trivial, so I stayed quiet and let them think what they wanted." "And now?" Ethan asked. "Now that they're calling you the bravest woman in Arizona?" "Now they finally see me, really see me. It shouldn't have taken me pointing a rifle at outlaws for that to happen, but I suppose that's how the world works sometimes. You have to do something dramatic before people notice you're there." "I notice you," Ethan said quietly. "I see you, Clara. The real you. And I'm starting to think I'm the luckiest man alive." Clara's hand stilled in the dirt and she turned to look at him fully. "Do you mean that? Or are you just saying what you think I want to hear?" "I mean it." Ethan set down his trowel and met her gaze directly. "When Buck made that bet, I thought my life was over. Thought I was being sentenced to a prison of domesticity and obligation. But you know what I've learned? I was already in a prison, one made of loneliness and aimlessness and running from anything that might make me vulnerable. You didn't trap me, Clara. You set me free." Tears welled in Clara's eyes, but she blinked them back. "You're making it very hard for me to maintain my reputation as the cold, practical wife." "Good, because you're not cold. You're fierce. There's a difference." Clara laughed, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand and leaving a smudge of dirt on her cheek. Ethan reached out and gently brushed it away, his thumb lingering on her cheekbone. She leaned into the touch, her eyes closing briefly, and Ethan felt his heart do something complicated in his chest. They were falling in love. Slowly, carefully, without any of the dramatic declarations or passionate moments that stories usually promised. Just two people learning each other, choosing each other, building something real from the ashes of a forced beginning. October brought cooler weather and a town social at the church hall. Ethan and Clara attended together, and Ethan found himself actually enjoying it. He danced with Clara, she was light on her feet despite claiming she had no skill, and he introduced her to men he'd played cards with, watching with satisfaction as they treated her with the respect she deserved. Women who'd ignored Clara before now sought her company. They wanted her advice on everything from shooting to marriage to standing up to difficult people. Clara handled the attention with grace, never pretending to be something she wasn't, but clearly pleased to finally be included in the social fabric of the town. "You're becoming quite popular," Ethan observed as they walked home under a sky full of stars. Clara had her arm linked through his, and the casual intimacy of it made him absurdly happy. "It's strange," Clara admitted. "All these years I wanted to be noticed, to be included. Now that I am, I'm not sure I like it as much as I thought I would. People can be exhausting." "We don't have to go to everything," Ethan said. "We can stay home if you prefer." "No, it's good to be part of the community. Good for both of us." Clara squeezed his arm. "Besides, you seem to enjoy yourself tonight. I saw you laughing with Chester and Jim Baker, making friends instead of just gambling associates. Maybe I'm learning that there's more to life than cards and whiskey. Maybe we're both learning that life can surprise us, that forced beginnings can lead to chosen futures." They walked the rest of the way in comfortable silence, and when they reached their house, Ethan held the door for Clara like she was precious cargo. Inside, Clara lit the lamps while Ethan stoked the fire in the hearth. The house glowed warm and welcoming, a far cry from the cold, awkward space it had been when they'd first moved in. Clara made tea, a habit she'd developed on cool evenings, and they sat together on the sofa that Malcolm had given them. Ethan found himself sitting closer to Clara than strictly necessary, found her leaning against him in a way that suggested comfort rather than mere tolerance. "Ethan," Clara said softly, her teacup cradled in both hands. I need to tell you something. The seriousness in her tone made Ethan tense. What is it? I'm happy. She turned to look at him, and her eyes were bright with emotion. For the first time in my life, I'm genuinely happy. This marriage that neither of us wanted has become the best thing that's ever happened to me. And I needed you to know that. Needed you to know that I'm not just making the best of a bad situation anymore. I'm choosing this. Choosing you. Choosing us. Ethan set down his own cup and took Clara's hands in his. I'm choosing us too. Every day. Every moment. You've changed my life, Clara. Changed me. Made me want to be better. Do better. Made me want to stay in one place for the first time in my adult life, because that place has you in it. So we're really doing this? Clara asked. Really making this marriage real? It's already real. Has been for a while now. We just needed time to catch up to that reality. Clara leaned forward, and for a moment Ethan thought she might kiss him. His heart raced at the possibility, at the thought of finally crossing that line they'd been dancing around for weeks. But instead she rested her forehead against his, her eyes closed, her breathing matching his. Thank you, she whispered, for giving us a chance, for not running when you easily could have. Thank you for making me want to stay. They sat like that for a long moment, not quite kissing but closer than they'd ever been, sharing breath and space and a profound sense of rightness. When they finally pulled apart, something had shifted again. Another barrier had fallen. They were no longer just partners or friends or spouses in name only. They were becoming something more. Something that didn't yet have a name but felt like the beginning of forever. The next few weeks brought a deepening of their connection. Small touches became common. Ethan's hand on Clara's back as they walked, Clara's fingers brushing Ethan's hair back from his forehead when he was reading. They began sleeping with their bedroom doors open, a silent acknowledgement that the separation between them was artificial and unnecessary. Ethan found himself thinking about Clara constantly when they were apart, the way she hummed while cooking, the concentration on her face when she was reading, the soft smile she wore when she thought no one was watching. He was falling in love with his wife, and the realization both thrilled and terrified him. November arrived with cooler temperatures and the promise of the town's annual harvest celebration. The event was a tradition in Coyote Ridge, a day of competitions, food, music, and socializing that marked the end of another year of survival in the harsh Arizona territory. This year, the organizers had added a shooting competition, and Clara's name was being mentioned as a favorite to win. You should enter, Ethan told her as they worked together to repair a section of fence that had come loose. Show everyone what you can do. Oh, I don't need to prove anything, Clara replied, hammering a nail with more force than necessary. Let them remember the outlaws. That's proof enough. This isn't about proving anything. It's about celebrating a skill you have, about taking pride in what you can do. Ethan set down his hammer and caught her hand. You've spent your whole life hiding who you are. Don't do it anymore. Let them see the real Clara Cole. The woman who can shoot, who can stand up to danger, who can face down whatever life throws at her. Clara studied his face, searching for something. You really want me to do this? I really do. I want the whole town to see what I see every day. How extraordinary you are. Flattery will get you everywhere, Mr. Cole, Clara said, but she was smiling. All right, I'll enter the competition, but only if you promise to be there cheering for me. I'll be in the front row, wouldn't miss it for the world. The day of the harvest celebration dawned clear and cool, perfect weather for outdoor activities. The town gathered at the large field on the eastern edge of Coyote Ridge, where organizers had set up tables for food, an area for music and dancing, and a shooting range marked with targets at varying distances. Ethan and Clara arrived mid-morning, joining the crowds already forming. Everywhere Ethan looked, he saw familiar faces: Chester from the Lucky Star, Mrs. Henderson with a group of women from her sewing circle, Malcolm Dawson helping organize the food tables, even Buck Morrison and his brother Reverend Morrison, apparently attempting to mend their fractured relationship through forced socializing. The shooting competition was scheduled for early afternoon, giving participants time to warm up and spectators time to place bets on their favorites. Ethan was amused to discover that Clara was listed as a serious contender, with odds that suggested people were taking her chances seriously. Look at that, he said, pointing to the betting board. You're favored to win. That just means I'll disappoint people if I don't, Clara replied, but there was a spark in her eyes that suggested she was looking forward to the challenge. 12 competitors entered the shooting contest, 11 men and Clara. Some of the men made jokes about competing against a woman, but their laughter died when they saw Clara check her rifle with the practiced ease of someone who knew exactly what she was doing. Jim Baker, who was running the competition, laid out the rules. 3 rounds of shooting at progressively more difficult targets, with points awarded for accuracy and speed. The first round was straightforward, hitting stationary targets at 50 yards. All 12 competitors completed this round successfully, though Clara's shots grouped tighter than most, her bullets striking within inches of dead center on each target. The second round increased the difficulty, targets at 75 yards, some partially obscured by obstacles, requiring shooters to calculate angles and compensate for wind. This round eliminated half the competitors, leaving 6 still in contention. Clara remained calm throughout, taking her time to line up each shot, breathing steadily, squeezing the trigger with perfect control. All 5 of her targets showed clean hits. By the third round, only 3 competitors remained. Clara, a rancher named Tom Sullivan, who was known as one of the best shots in the territory, and a young man named Danny, who worked as a deputy and practiced constantly. The crowd had grown substantially, with what seemed like the entire town gathered to watch. The final challenge was the most difficult, hitting a playing card, the ace of spades, tacked to a post at 100 yards. Each competitor would get 3 shots. Highest score won. Tom went first. His first shot missed entirely. His second clipped the edge of the card. His third hit closer to center but still off by several inches. Respectable shooting, but not winning shooting. Danny went next. His first 2 shots hit the post but missed the card. His third shot struck the card dead center, producing cheers from the crowd. It was an impressive shot, and Danny knew it, grinning widely as he stepped back. Clara was last. She checked her rifle one more time, chambered around, and stepped up to the line. The crowd fell silent. Ethan could see the concentration on her face, the way she blocked out everything except the target and the rifle and the shot she needed to make. Her first shot struck the card slightly left of center. A good shot, but not good enough to win. She chambered another round, adjusted her stance minutely, and fired. The bullet tore through the card, closer to center this time, overlapping the edge of Danny's shot. 1 shot left. Clara needed to hit dead center to win. Ethan could see the pressure in the set of her shoulders, the way she took an extra moment to steady her breathing. The entire town seemed to be holding its breath with her. Clara squeezed the trigger. The shot cracked across the field, and the ace of spades, already damaged by previous shots, split almost perfectly down the middle as Clara's bullet struck the exact center. The crowd erupted. People were cheering, shouting, congratulating Clara and each other for witnessing such shooting. Jim Baker examined the target, confirmed the hit, and declared Clara Cole the winner of Coyote Ridge's first annual shooting competition. Ethan pushed through the crowd to reach Clara, who stood looking slightly dazed by the attention, her rifle lowered but still held with casual competence. When she saw him, her face broke into a smile so radiant it took his breath away. "You did it," Ethan said, pulling her into his arms and lifting her off the ground in his enthusiasm. "You actually did it." "I can't believe it," Clara said, laughing as he set her back down. "I've never shot in front of people before. I thought I'd be too nervous." "You were incredible. Absolutely incredible." Ethan couldn't stop smiling, couldn't stop touching her, her arms, her face, her hands, assuring himself that this was real, that his wife had just won a shooting competition against the best shots in the territory. The rest of the day passed in a blur of congratulations and celebration. Clara was presented with a blue ribbon and a silver cup engraved with her name. She was interviewed by the editor of the town's small newspaper. She was surrounded by women who wanted to learn to shoot and men who wanted to understand how she'd made that final shot. Through it all, Ethan stayed by her side, his pride in her so profound it was almost painful. This was his wife. This extraordinary, fierce, talented woman was his wife. The universe had forced them together through a stupid bet, but somehow that forced beginning had led to this, to Clara standing in front of the whole town, celebrated and respected, and finally seen for who she truly was. As evening fell and the celebration continued with music and dancing, Ethan and Clara found a quiet spot on the edge of the festivities. They sat on a hay bale, watching the town enjoy itself, and Ethan felt a contentment he'd never known before. This was happiness. This was home. This was everything he'd been running from his entire adult life, and now he couldn't imagine wanting anything else. "Thank you for pushing me to enter," Clara said softly, leaning against his shoulder. "You were right. Felt good to show them, to finally be seen. You deserve to be seen, deserve to be celebrated. So do you." Clara turned to look at him. "You've changed too, Ethan. You're not the same man who stumbled home drunk and destroyed my garden. You're someone who shows up, who stays, who builds instead of destroys. You deserve recognition for that too." "The only recognition I need is from you," Ethan said. "Knowing that you see who I'm trying to become, that you believe in that person. That's enough." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching stars begin to appear in the darkening sky. The music from the celebration drifted over them, and Ethan could hear laughter and conversation, the sounds of a community at peace. "Ethan," Clara said finally, her voice quiet but certain. "I love you." The words hung in the air between them, simple and profound. Ethan's heart stuttered, then began to race. She loved him, this woman who'd been forced to marry him, who'd had every reason to resent him, who'd seen him at his worst and still chosen to believe in his best. She loved him. "Clara." Ethan took her face in his hands, making sure she was looking at him, making sure she could see the truth in his eyes. "I love you too. I think I've been falling in love with you for weeks, maybe months. I was just too scared to admit it." "Are you still scared?" "Terrified. But not of loving you, of losing you, of somehow messing this up and breaking the best thing that's ever happened to me." "You won't lose me," Clara said firmly. "I'm not going anywhere. We're partners, remember? We face things together." "Partners," Ethan agreed. Then finally he leaned down and kissed her. It wasn't their first kiss, that had been at their wedding, a brief, obligatory touch of lips that had meant nothing. This kiss was everything that one hadn't been. It was soft and sweet and searching, a question and an answer all at once. Clara's hands came up to tangle in his hair, pulling him closer, and Ethan felt like his entire world had narrowed to this moment, this woman, this perfect rightness. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Clara's eyes were bright with tears and joy. "We should probably go home," she whispered. "Yeah," Ethan agreed, his voice rough. "We should." They walked back to Cottonwood Lane hand in hand, leaving the celebration behind. The night was cool and clear, and their house glowed with lamplight when they arrived, welcoming them home. Ethan opened the door and ushered Clara inside, and for the first time since their wedding night, she didn't retreat to her storeroom. She stood in the main room looking at Ethan with an expression that was both nervous and determined. "I don't want to sleep in the storeroom anymore," she said softly. "I want to sleep in our room. With you. If you want that too." "I want that more than anything," Ethan replied honestly. "But only if you're sure. Only if it's what you really want." "I'm sure." Clara moved closer to him, placing her hands on his chest. "I'm your wife, Ethan. Really your wife now. In every way that matters. And I want this marriage to be real. Completely real." Ethan pulled her close, kissing her forehead, her cheeks, her lips. "It's already real," he murmured between kisses. "But I'm happy to make it more real." Clara laughed against his mouth, and the sound was full of joy and relief and love. They moved toward the bedroom together, leaving the door open because they had nothing to hide anymore. The house that had started as a trap had become a sanctuary. The marriage that had begun as a punishment had become a blessing. Later, much later, they lay tangled together in the darkness, Clara's head on Ethan's chest, his arms wrapped around her. Outside, the wind whispered through the cottonwood trees that gave their lane its name. Inside, everything was warm and safe and perfect. "Ethan," Clara murmured sleepily, "do you ever think about how different our lives would be if Buck hadn't made that bet?" "Sometimes. Ethan admitted. I'd probably still be drifting, playing cards, drinking too much, never staying anywhere long enough to build anything real. And I'd probably still be the quiet girl in my father's store, watching life happen to other people but never really living myself. So maybe we should thank Buck, Ethan suggested. In a weird way, his cruelty gave us this, gave us each other. Don't let him hear you say that, Clara said with a yawn. He'll never let us forget it. Let him talk. Let the whole town talk. I don't care what anyone says as long as I have you. Clara lifted her head to look at him, and even in the darkness, he could see the love in her eyes. You have me. Forever. That's a promise. Forever sounds perfect, Ethan replied, pulling her close again. Absolutely perfect. They fell asleep like that, wrapped in each other and in the knowledge that they'd survived the worst and found the best. The bet that had brought them together no longer mattered. What mattered was what they'd built from those forced beginnings. What mattered was the choice they made every day to love each other, to support each other, to be partners in this life they were creating together. Outside, the Arizona night stretched vast and star-filled above Coyote Ridge. Inside the small house on Cottonwood Lane, two people who'd been strangers forced together by chance had become lovers bound together by choice. The quiet woman had found her voice. The drifting gambler had found his home. And in finding each other, they'd both found themselves. But even in the midst of perfect happiness, life had one more lesson to teach them about who they really were and what they were capable of when pushed too far. The happiness that followed that night was so complete, so all-encompassing, that Ethan sometimes woke in the darkness afraid it was all a dream. He'd reach for Clara in those moments, finding her warm and real beside him, and the relief would wash over him like sunrise. She was his. He was hers. The impossible had become inevitable, and every day felt like a gift he didn't quite deserve, but was determined to earn. Winter arrived in Arizona with cool nights and mild days, transforming the harsh landscape into something almost gentle. The garden they'd planted together lay dormant, but not dead, waiting for spring to bring it back to life. Inside their home, Clara had made curtains from fabric Mrs. Henderson had helped her choose, deep blue with white stars that made the windows look like pieces of night sky. Books lined the shelves Ethan had built. Clara's rifle hung above the mantel beside Ethan's gun belt, twin symbols of their partnership and strength. December brought preparations for Christmas, and for the first time in years, Ethan found himself looking forward to the holiday instead of dreading it. Clara threw herself into making their house festive, stringing pine branches along the mantel, baking cookies that filled the air with cinnamon and sugar, planning a Christmas dinner for Malcolm and a few close friends they'd made in town. Life had settled into a rhythm that felt sustainable, comfortable, right. Ethan still played cards at the Lucky Star, but now he talked about his wife with pride rather than resentment. Clara continued helping her father at the store, but now she walked with her head high, confident in who she was and her place in the community. They were no longer the source of gossip and speculation. They'd become just another couple in Coyote Ridge, albeit one with a more interesting origin story than most. But peace never lasted forever, especially not in the Arizona territory where violence simmered just beneath the surface of civilization. The reminder came on a cold morning in mid-December, 3 days before Christmas. Ethan had gone to town early to pick up supplies Clara needed for her Christmas dinner. He was walking back to where he'd tied his horse when he saw them. 5 men lounging outside the Lucky Star, their horses tied to the rail. His heart sank as he recognized Jake Thornton in their midst, along with 3 of the men who'd ridden with him before. The 5th man was new, bigger, and meaner looking than the others, with a scar running down his face and eyes that held no mercy. Ethan considered turning around, heading back to find the sheriff, but it was too late. Jake had spotted him, and his face split into a smile that held no warmth. "Well, well," Jake called out. "If it ain't Ethan Cole. Been a while, hasn't it?" "Not long enough." Ethan kept walking toward his horse, acutely aware that his gun was at home. He'd stopped wearing it around town, stopped thinking of himself as someone who needed to be armed every moment. That oversight might cost him now. "Where you heading in such a hurry?" Jake pushed off from the wall he'd been leaning against. "Thought we might have that conversation we started last time. The one your little wife interrupted." Nothing to talk about, Jake. That card game was years ago. Let it go. Can't do that. Jake moved to block Ethan's path. See? You made me look like a fool. Made me back down in front of my men. That's something I can't let stand. The other 4 men had spread out, forming a loose circle around Ethan. People on the street were noticing now, stopping to watch, some hurrying inside to fetch help. But help would take time, and Ethan didn't know if he had time. This is stupid, Jake, Ethan said, keeping his voice level. You really want to risk hanging over something that happened 2 years ago, over a card game? Ain't about the cards anymore. It's about respect. You took mine. I'm taking it back. The big man with the scar stepped forward. We doing this or just talking? His voice was gravelly, like he'd swallowed broken glass. I didn't ride all the way from Tucson to listen to conversation. We're doing it, Jake confirmed. Cole, you got 10 seconds to draw. After that, we open fire. And if innocent folks get hit, that's on you. Ethan's mind raced. He was unarmed, outnumbered, and out of options. He could try to run, but they'd shoot him in the back. He could try to rush Jake, but the others would gun him down before he got close. There was no good way out of this. After everything, after finding love, finding home, finding a reason to live, he was going to die in the street 3 days before Christmas because of a card game and wounded pride. 1, Jake began counting. Ethan tensed, preparing to at least die fighting rather than standing still. 2. Movement caught his eye. People clearing the street, ducking into buildings. Smart. At least fewer innocent people would be hurt. 3. More movement, this time from an unexpected direction. The door of the general store opened. 4. Clara stepped out onto the boardwalk, her Winchester in her hands. 5. She raised the rifle to her shoulder with the calm precision Ethan had seen at the shooting competition. 6. Jake Thornton, Clara's voice cut across the street, clear and cold as mountain water. You shoot my husband, you'll be dead before his body hits the ground. I guarantee it. Jake's count faltered. All 5 men turned to look at Clara, who stood on the boardwalk in her simple gray dress, looking like an avenging angel with her rifle aimed steady and sure. This ain't your business, Mrs. Cole, Jake said, but Ethan could hear the uncertainty in his voice. This is between men. This became my business the moment you threatened my husband. Clara took 3 steps forward, moving to a better position. I beat 11 men at the shooting competition last month, men who'd been shooting their whole lives. You think I can't take 5 of you? You think I'll hesitate to protect what's mine? The sheriff appeared at the end of the street, running with his deputy. Malcolm Dawson emerged from his store with a shotgun. Chester came out of the Lucky Star with his own rifle. Other men were arming themselves, surrounding Jake and his men. You're outnumbered, Ethan said quietly. Outgunned. And you've got the best shot in the territory drawing a bead on your heart right now, so why don't you and your boys mount up and ride out while you still can? Jake looked around, seeing the situation deteriorating rapidly. The big man with the scar muttered something ugly under his breath, but even he could read the odds. They were 5 men surrounded by an increasingly armed and hostile town, with Clara Cole's rifle pointed at them like the finger of judgment. This ain't over, Cole, Jake said, but it was the hollow threat of a man who knew he'd lost. Yes, it is, Clara replied before Ethan could speak. It's over because if I see you in this town again, if I hear you've threatened my husband again, if you so much as think his name with ill intent, I will hunt you down myself. And unlike you, I don't miss. The absolute conviction in her voice sent chills down Ethan's spine. This was Clara unleashed, all the fire and fierceness he'd glimpsed in private now on full display. She wasn't bluffing. Everyone watching knew she wasn't bluffing. Most importantly, Jake knew she wasn't bluffing. Let's go, boys, Jake muttered, backing toward his horse. Town ain't worth the trouble. They mounted up and rode out slowly, trying to maintain some shred of dignity in their retreat. The crowd watched them go in silence, and it wasn't until the 5 men were completely out of sight that people began to breathe normally again. Ethan walked straight to Clara, who lowered her rifle with shaking hands now that the danger had passed. He pulled her into his arms, not caring who was watching, not caring about anything except the fact that she was safe, and he was safe, and she'd once again saved his life. You're going to stop doing that, he said into her hair. My heart can't take it. Doing what? Clara's voice was muffled against his chest. facing down armed men to save me. It's supposed to work the other way around. Clara pulled back to look at him, and there was steel in her eyes along with love. We're partners, remember? We protect each other. That's what we do. That's what you do, Ethan corrected. I just stand there like an idiot without my gun while you face down outlaws. You weren't an idiot. You were trying to avoid violence. That's called growth. Clara smiled despite the trembling in her hands. But maybe start wearing your gun again, just in case. The sheriff approached, his expression a mixture of relief and exasperation. Mrs. Cole, I appreciate what you did, but you can't just go around threatening people with rifles. That's my job. Then maybe do it faster, Clara replied with surprising sharpness. My husband was about to be murdered in the street. I didn't see you stopping it. I came as fast as I could. Not fast enough. Clara's voice softened slightly. I'm sorry, Sheriff Thompson. I know you're doing your best. But when someone threatens my family, I'm going to act. That's just how it is. Sheriff Thompson sighed. I understand. And truth be told, you probably saved lives today. Jake Thornton and his boys would have shot up half the street if they'd gotten started. But please, try to let me handle these things in the future. I'll consider it, Clara said, which wasn't exactly agreement, but was the best the sheriff was going to get. The crowd that had gathered began to disperse, though people stopped to congratulate Clara on her bravery and to assure Ethan how lucky he was to have such a wife. Malcolm appeared beside them, his face pale but proud. My girl, he said, shaking his head in wonder. When did you get so fierce? I've always been fierce, Clara replied. I just finally have something worth being fierce about. The three of them, Ethan, Clara, and Malcolm, walked back to the general store together, and Ethan realized his hands were shaking now that the adrenaline was wearing off. How close had he come to dying? How many times was Clara going to have to save him before he learned to save himself? You're thinking too hard, Clara observed as they entered the store. I can see it on your face. I'm thinking I'm the worst kind of husband. The kind who gets rescued by his wife instead of protecting her. No, Clara said firmly. You're the best kind of husband. The kind who's learned that strength comes in many forms. That protection isn't just physical. That a real partnership means letting each other use their strengths instead of pretending only one kind of strength matters. She's right, Malcolm added. Most men would be embarrassed to have their wife defend them. But you're proud of her. That takes a different kind of strength. The kind that's harder to find than the kind that comes from a gun. Ethan looked at Clara, really looked at her. She was right, so was Malcolm. He wasn't weak because Clara had saved him. He was strong enough to let her be who she was, to celebrate her capabilities instead of being threatened by them. That was its own kind of courage. You're right, Ethan said finally. Both of you. And Clara, I am proud of you. So damn proud I can barely stand it. You're the bravest person I've ever known. Good, Clara replied, then surprised him by standing on her toes to kiss him right there in her father's store. Because I plan to keep being brave. Someone has to keep you alive. The incident with Jake Thornton became another story that spread through Coyote Ridge and beyond. The legend of Clara Cole grew. The woman who'd won the shooting competition, who'd faced down outlaws not once but twice, who protected her husband with the same fierce devotion she brought to everything she did. Some versions of the story had her shooting the guns out of all 5 men's hands. Others had her delivering a speech about justice that made grown men weep. The truth was dramatic enough, but truth rarely stopped a good story from getting better. Christmas arrived and their small house filled with warmth and laughter. Malcolm came for dinner, along with Chester from the Lucky Star and Mrs. Henderson. They ate Clara's excellent cooking, drank Ethan's carefully hoarded good whiskey, and told stories that grew more exaggerated with each glass. It was, Ethan thought, the best Christmas he'd ever had, not because of the food or the gifts or the decorations, but because he was surrounded by people who cared about him, by people who'd become family not through blood, but through choice. As winter gave way to spring, life in their house on Cottonwood Lane continued to deepen and grow. The garden came back to life under their combined care, the plants pushing through the soil with determined green shoots. Clara was teaching Ethan to read for pleasure rather than just necessity, introducing him to novels and poetry he'd never imagined enjoying. Ethan was teaching Clara to play cards, and she was annoyingly good at it, her ability to read people translating perfectly to reading opponents across a poker table. They talked about the future more now, about maybe buying more land, about the possibility of children someday, though neither felt rushed about that, about growing old together in this place they'd made their own. The bet that had brought them together was barely mentioned anymore. It had become an interesting footnote to their story, rather than its defining feature. One evening in late March, as they sat on their porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in impossible colors, Clara turned to Ethan with a question that had clearly been on her mind. "Do you ever regret it? The bet, I mean. Do you ever wish you just walked away that night, run like you wanted to?" Ethan considered the question seriously. Did he regret it? 6 months ago, even 3 months ago, he might have said yes, might have mourned the freedom he'd lost, the life of drifting and gambling and never being tied down. But now? Not even a little bit, he said honestly. That bet was the best thing that ever happened to me. It brought me you, brought me this. He gestured at their house, their land, the life they'd built. I thought I wanted freedom, but what I really wanted was purpose, belonging, a reason to wake up in the morning that wasn't just finding the next card game or the next bottle of whiskey. You gave me all of that. Claire's eyes glistened with tears she didn't try to hide. You gave me the same thing. Before you, I was just existing, watching life happen to other people while I hid behind the counter in my father's store. You made me brave enough to step into my own life, to be who I really am instead of who I thought I had to be. So we saved each other, Ethan said, pulling her close. That seems fair? More than fair. It seems perfect. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, Claire's head on Ethan's shoulder, his arm around her waist. The sky continued its nightly show, colors fading from orange to pink to purple as the sun sank below the horizon. Somewhere in town, a dog barked. A wagon rattled past on the main road. Life in Coyote Ridge continued its steady rhythm. Ethan, Clara said softly, I have something to tell you. The seriousness in her tone made Ethan tense. What is it? Are you all right? I'm fine. Better than fine. Clara turned to face him, and even in the fading light, he could see the joy and nervousness warring on her face. I'm pregnant. We're going to have a baby. The words took a moment to process. A baby. Their baby. Ethan had known it was possible, had even thought about it abstractly, but hearing it said aloud made it suddenly, profoundly real. You're sure? He asked, his voice rough with emotion. I'm sure. I've suspected for a few weeks, but I wanted to be certain before I told you. Dr. Morrison confirmed it yesterday. Dr. Morrison knows before I do? Ethan tried to sound indignant, but couldn't keep the smile off his face. I had to be sure, Clara repeated. I didn't want to get your hopes up if I was wrong. My hopes? Ethan pulled her into his lap, cradling her like she was made of glass. Clara, this is the best news I've ever heard. We're going to be parents. We're going to have a family. Are you happy? Clara asked, searching his face. Really happy? I know we never specifically planned for this, and I know it's going to change everything. Ethan silenced her with a kiss. I'm not just happy. I'm overjoyed. Terrified, but overjoyed. When? September, the doctor thinks. Late September or early October. September. 6 months away. 6 months to prepare, to get ready, to transform from just a couple into a family. Ethan's mind was already racing ahead. They'd need to convert the storeroom into a proper nursery, would need to buy or build a cradle, would need to prepare for all the ways their lives were about to change. We should tell your father, Ethan said. He's going to be a grandfather. He deserves to know. Tomorrow, Clara agreed. Tonight, I just want it to be us. Our secret for one more night. They stayed on the porch long after full dark fell, talking about names and possibilities and the strange, wonderful future that was rushing toward them. When they finally went inside, Ethan was hyper-aware of Clara in a new way, aware that she was carrying their child, that her body was doing something miraculous and terrifying, that their love had created something new and precious. That night, lying in their bed with Clara curled against him, Ethan thought about how impossibly far he'd come from that night in the Lucky Star Saloon. The man who'd made that drunken bet barely existed anymore. He'd been replaced by someone new, someone who had a wife he adored, a home he cherished, and a child on the way. Someone who'd finally learned that being tied down wasn't a trap, it was a foundation, a place to build from rather than something to escape. The months that followed were full of preparation and joy. Malcolm was beside himself with excitement about becoming a grandfather, immediately beginning to construct furniture for the nursery with skill Ethan hadn't known he possessed. Mrs. Henderson and the other women of Coyote Ridge descended on Clara with advice and gifts and offers of help. Even Buck Morrison stopped by one afternoon with a hand-carved rocking chair and an apology for how he'd started their marriage. "Turned out all right in the end," Buck said gruffly, not quite meeting Ethan's eyes. "But I'm still sorry for the way it began. This is my way of making amends." The rocking chair was beautiful, made from smooth wood that gleamed like honey in lamplight. Clara cried when she saw it, and Buck fled before she could hug him, uncomfortable with emotional displays but clearly pleased that his gift had been well received. Summer arrived, and with it came heat that made Clara uncomfortable and tired. Ethan fussed over her constantly, bringing her water and cold compresses, making sure she rested in the heat of the day, taking over most of the household work, despite her protests that she was pregnant, not helpless. "Let me take care of you," Ethan would say whenever Clara objected. "You're growing our child. That's hard work. Let me handle everything else." And Clara, who'd spent so much of her life being independent and self-sufficient, slowly learned to let herself be cared for, to accept help, to lean on Ethan the way he'd learned to lean on her. August brought a late-season storm, nothing like the one they'd weathered in their early marriage, but enough to remind them of that night when they'd first learned to work together. They sat inside, listening to rain drum on the roof, and reminisced about all that had happened since. "Do you remember how angry I was that night?" Ethan asked, his hand resting on Clara's swollen belly. "How resentful and bitter." "I remember," Clara confirmed. "I remember thinking you were going to leave, that I'd wake up and you'd be gone. I almost did leave, almost saddled my horse a dozen times." Ethan felt the baby kick against his palm and smiled. "But I'm glad I didn't. Glad I was too stubborn or too proud or too something to run." "I'm glad too. Though I won't lie, there were moments I wanted to shoot you instead of save you." They laughed together, comfortable enough now to joke about those difficult early days. The pain and awkwardness had faded, replaced by affection and understanding, and a love so deep it sometimes scared Ethan with its intensity. September arrived with cooler temperatures and a sense of anticipation that hung over their house like morning mist. Clara was huge now, uncomfortable and impatient, ready for their child to arrive. Ethan was a bundle of nervous energy, jumping at every sound, certain that this would be the moment labor began. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon in late September. Ethan was working in the garden when Clara appeared in the doorway, her face calm but strained. "It's time," she said simply. "The baby's coming." Ethan dropped his shovel and practically ran to her. "Now? Right now? Should I get the doctor? Should I get your father? Should I—" "Breathe," Clara interrupted, somehow managing to be the calm one despite being in labor. "Get Dr. Morrison. Get my father. Get Mrs. Henderson. But first, help me inside." The next several hours were the longest of Ethan's life. Dr. Morrison and Mrs. Henderson took over, shooing Ethan out of his own bedroom, leaving him to pace the main room while Clara labored. Malcolm arrived and sat with him, both of them too nervous to do anything but wait and pray. The sounds coming from the bedroom were terrifying, Clara's cries of pain, the murmur of voices, the sense of something momentous happening behind that closed door. Ethan wanted to burst in, to be with her, but Mrs. Henderson had been firm that this was women's work and he'd just be in the way. Sunset came and went, full dark fell. Ethan had worn a path in the floor from pacing when he finally heard it, a thin, reedy cry that was unmistakably a baby. His baby. Their baby. He froze, hardly daring to breathe. The bedroom door opened and Mrs. Henderson appeared, her face tired but smiling. "You have a daughter, Mr. Cole. A beautiful, healthy daughter. And your wife did wonderfully. She's asking for you." Ethan didn't remember crossing the room. Suddenly he was just there, beside the bed, looking down at Clara's exhausted but radiant face. And in her arms, wrapped in a blanket Malcolm had purchased months ago, was their daughter. She was tiny, perfect, with dark hair like Clara's and eyes that were trying to focus on the strange new world she'd entered. Her little fist waved in the air, and when Ethan tentatively touched it, her fingers wrapped around his thumb with surprising strength. "She's beautiful," Ethan whispered, afraid that speaking too loudly might break the spell. "Clara, she's perfect. You're perfect. You did this." "We did this," Clara corrected gently. "Together. That's how we do everything, remember?" Dr. Morrison finished his work and departed, leaving instructions for Clara's recovery. Mrs. Henderson tidied up and then left as well, promising to return in the morning to help. Malcolm stayed only long enough to kiss his daughter's forehead and hold his granddaughter for a brief moment before departing to give the new family privacy. And then it was just the three of them, Ethan, Clara, and their daughter, whose name they'd decided weeks ago, but which felt even more right now that she was here. "Margaret," Clara said softly, looking down at the baby. "Margaret Ann Cole. For your mother." Ethan's eyes burned. His mother had died when he was barely older than a child himself, and he'd thought that grief had faded. But hearing her name spoken in connection with this new life brought it all back, bittersweet and beautiful. "Margaret," he repeated. "Maggie for short?" "Maggie," Clara agreed. "Our little Maggie." They sat together through that first night, taking turns holding their daughter, marveling at her tiny fingers and perfect features, trying to believe that this miracle was really theirs. Ethan had faced down outlaws and storms, had survived loss and loneliness and his own worst impulses. But nothing had prepared him for the overwhelming love he felt looking at his daughter. The weeks that followed were exhausting and wonderful in equal measure. Maggie was a good baby, but still a baby, crying in the night, needing constant attention. Clara recovered well, though she was tired in a way that went bone deep. Ethan discovered talents he hadn't known he possessed. He could change a diaper efficiently, could soothe a crying infant with gentle rocking and soft songs, could function on 2 hours of sleep and still feel like the luckiest man alive. The town rallied around them. People brought food, offers of help, gifts for the baby. Malcolm was there almost daily, unable to stay away from his granddaughter for long. Even Chester from the Lucky Star showed up with a silver rattle he claimed had been in his family for generations. By the time Maggie was 3 months old, life had settled into a new rhythm. The house was noisier now, filled with baby sounds and the detritus of infant care. Clara had converted part of her beloved book collection into storage for baby clothes and supplies. Ethan had built an addition onto the house, a proper nursery that gave them all more space. Christmas came again, their second as a married couple, but first as a family. Malcolm came for dinner along with Chester, Mrs. Henderson, and Buck Morrison, who'd become an unlikely friend. They gathered around the table Clara and Ethan had shared so many meals at, and Ethan looked at the faces surrounding him, the people who'd become his family through choice rather than blood, and felt a contentment so profound it was almost painful. "I want to propose a toast," he said, standing with his glass raised. Everyone quieted, looking at him expectantly. "A year ago, I thought my life was over. Thought I'd been trapped into a marriage I didn't want, shackled to responsibilities I couldn't handle. I was wrong about all of it. This marriage saved me. This woman saved me." He looked at Clara, who sat beside him with Maggie dozing in her arms. "You took a broken, directionless gambler and gave him a purpose, a home, a family. You didn't tame me, Clara. You set me free. Free to be the man I always could have been if I'd just been brave enough to try. So here's to you, to us, to the bet that brought us together and the love that keeps us there." "To Clara and Ethan," Malcolm echoed, raising his glass. "And to Maggie, the best thing to ever come from a card game." They drank and laughed, and the evening continued with stories and songs and the warmth that came from being among people who genuinely cared about each other. Later, after everyone had gone home and Maggie was asleep in her cradle, Clara and Ethan stood together at the window, looking out at the star-filled Arizona sky. "Do you think people will still be talking about us years from now?" Clara asked. "About how we started?" "Probably," Ethan admitted. "Small towns love a good story, and ours is a damn good story." "What will they say, do you think?" Ethan considered. They'll say that a gambler lost a bet and was forced to marry the quietest woman in town. They'll say he thought his life was over, but it was actually just beginning. They'll say she saved him more times than he saved her, and that their love story started with humiliation, but ended with happiness. That's not quite right, Clara said thoughtfully. It didn't end with happiness. It began with humiliation and grew into happiness. But it hasn't ended. It's still growing, still becoming something more. You're right. Ethan wrapped his arms around her from behind, resting his chin on the top of her head. So what would you say if someone asked you to tell our story? Clara was quiet for a moment, thinking. Finally, she said, I'd say that sometimes the universe knows what we need, even when we don't. That forced beginnings can lead to chosen forever. That the bravest thing you can do is stay when everything in you wants to run. And that love isn't something that happens to you. It's something you build one day, one choice, one act of courage at a time. That's beautiful, Ethan murmured. You should write that down. Maybe I will. Maybe I'll write our whole story down someday. So Maggie knows. So her children know. So they understand that even things that start badly can end well if you're willing to work for it. The years that followed proved Clara right. Their story did continue to grow and evolve. Maggie was joined by 2 more children, a son they named Thomas Malcolm and another daughter named Rose. The house on Cottonwood Lane expanded to accommodate their growing family. The garden that had started as Clara's solitary project became a family endeavor, all of them working together to coax life from the Arizona soil. Ethan never returned to serious gambling. He played cards with friends for small stakes and enjoyment, but the desperate, seeking quality that had driven him in his younger years was gone. He'd found what he was looking for, and it had nothing to do with the next big win or the next town over the horizon. Clara's reputation as a sharpshooter spread beyond Coyote Ridge. She was invited to shooting competitions in towns across the territory, and she won more often than she lost, bringing home ribbons and trophies that she displayed with pride. But her greatest pride wasn't in her shooting, it was in her family, in the home she'd built, in the life she'd created from the ashes of humiliation and forced vows. Malcolm Dawson lived long enough to see all 3 of his grandchildren grow into school age. He passed peacefully in his sleep one winter night, and Ethan and Clara mourned him deeply. But they also celebrated him, remembering how he'd supported them from the beginning, how he'd believed in their marriage even when they didn't believe in it themselves. The Lucky Star Saloon remained a fixture in Coyote Ridge, and Ethan remained one of its regular customers, though now he brought his family for dinner rather than going alone to gamble and drink. Chester grew old but never retired, claiming he'd die behind that bar and be happy about it. Mrs. Henderson continued to sew and gossip and be the first to know everything that happened in town. Buck Morrison became a surprising fixture in their lives, a quasi-uncle to their children who brought them gifts and told them wild stories about the old days. The story of how Ethan and Clara came to be married never faded from local legend. New residents to Coyote Ridge would hear it within their first week, the tale of the gambler who lost a bet and the quiet woman who became his wife. But the story grew and changed with time, taking on mythic qualities. Some versions had Clara shooting the cards out of Ethan's hand to stop the game. Others had her demanding marriage rather than accepting it. The truth got lost in the retellings, but the essence remained. 2 people who shouldn't have worked but did, who were forced together by chance and stayed together by choice. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Ethan and Clara stood in the same spot where they'd said their vows, the small church in Coyote Ridge that had witnessed the beginning of their journey. The church was fuller now for the anniversary celebration than it had been for the wedding. Their children sat in the front row, along with friends and neighbors who'd watched their marriage grow from joke to inspiration. Reverend Morrison, older but still officiating, smiled at them. 10 years ago, I stood here and married 2 people who didn't know each other and didn't particularly want to be married. Today, I stand here with 2 people who've shown this entire town what marriage can be when both partners are willing to work for it. Ethan, Clara, would you like to renew your vows? They would. They said the same words they'd said 10 years ago, but this time the words had weight and meaning. This time, when Ethan said, I do, he meant it with every fiber of his being. This time, when Clara said, I do, her voice rang clear and strong, no longer the whispered response of a frightened girl. but the confident declaration of a woman who knew exactly what she was choosing. When Reverend Morrison invited Ethan to kiss his bride, Ethan took Clara's face in his hands and kissed her the way he'd wanted to that first time, with love and passion and promise and joy. The congregation erupted in applause, and their children laughed, and it was perfect. That night, after the celebration had ended and the children were asleep, Ethan and Clara sat on their porch as they had so many times before. The Arizona sky spread above them, vast and star-filled and eternal. "Do you remember what you said that first morning?" Ethan asked, "after our wedding night?" "I said a lot of things." "Which one?" "You said we didn't need to pretend our marriage was more than a business arrangement, that we'd keep separate lives under the same roof." Clara laughed softly. "I was so young, so naive, thinking we could share a house and not share our lives." "You were protecting yourself," Ethan said generously. "We both were, trying to maintain walls that never should have been there in the first place. I'm glad we tore them down." "Me too." Ethan pulled Clara close, and she settled against him with the ease of long practice. "You know what the real miracle is? Not that we made the marriage work, but that we made each other better. I'm a better man because of you, kinder, more patient, more willing to build than destroy." "And I'm braver because of you," Clara replied, "more willing to be seen, to take risks, to live instead of just exist." They sat in comfortable silence, listening to the night sounds of Arizona, wind in the cottonwoods, the distant call of an owl, the gentle creaking of their house settling. Somewhere in town, someone was laughing. Life continued its endless rhythm. "Ethan," Clara said after a while, "do you think we would have fallen in love eventually if the bet had never happened? If we'd met some other way?" "I don't know," Ethan admitted. "Maybe, maybe not. The question assumes we would have noticed each other at all without being forced together. You were so quiet back then, and I was so self-absorbed. We might have lived in the same town for years and never really seen each other. So maybe the bet was necessary. Maybe that's the only way our story could have happened. Maybe. Or maybe we would have found each other somehow. The universe has a way of pushing people together who need each other." "A romantic sentiment from a former gambler," Clara teased. "You made me a romantic. Added it to the list of things I never thought I'd be." Ethan kissed the top of her head. "Along with husband, father, homeowner, and ridiculously happy man." "I like that list. It's a good list. It's the best list, and it all started with the worst night of my life." "Mine too," Clara agreed. "Funny how that works. How the worst things can lead to the best things if you're willing to do the work." Years continued to pass. Their children grew and eventually left to make their own lives. Maggie married a rancher and moved north. Thomas became a doctor and opened a practice in Tucson. Rose, independent and fierce like her mother, became a teacher and traveled throughout the territory bringing education to remote communities. Ethan and Clara grew old together in their house on Cottonwood Lane. His hair turned gray, then white. Her hands developed the calluses and lines that came from a life of work, but they still held hands on the porch in the evenings. Still worked together in the garden that had become legendary in its own right. Still chose each other every morning when they woke up in the bed they'd shared for decades. By the time they were in their 60s, their story had become genuine legend. Children in Coyote Ridge grew up hearing about Clara Cole, the sharpshooter who'd faced down outlaws and won shooting competitions across the territory. They heard about Ethan Cole, the gambler who'd lost a bet but won a life. They heard different versions of the story, each one colored by the teller's perspective, but the heart of it remained true. Two people forced together by circumstances who chose to stay together by love. One evening, 40 years after that fateful card game, Ethan and Clara sat on their porch watching the sunset. They were old now, their bodies worn by time and work and life, but their connection was as strong as ever. Stronger, even, forged by decades of choosing each other through good times and hard times. "You know what I think the real story is?" Ethan said, breaking a comfortable silence. "It's not about me being tamed. That's what people like to say, that the wild gambler was tamed by the quiet woman. But that's not what happened." "No?" Clara's voice held amusement. "What did happen then?" "You set me free. I was trapped in a life that was killing me slowly, all surface and no depth, all movement and no direction. I thought I was free because I could go anywhere, but really I was in prison because I couldn't stay anywhere. You taught me that real freedom comes from having something worth staying for, someone worth building a life with, purpose, meaning, love. Those things set me free in ways running never could. Clara was quiet for a long moment. You set me free too. I was trapped by my own fear, by my need to be invisible, by the belief that I wasn't worth being seen. You saw me when no one else did. You believed in me before I believed in myself. You gave me permission to be brave. So we saved each other, Ethan said, echoing words they'd spoken countless times over the years. We saved each other, Clara confirmed, and we built something beautiful in the process. They sat hand in hand as the sun sank below the horizon, painting the sky in impossible colors one more time. Their children were scattered across the territory, living their own lives, building their own stories. Their grandchildren were growing up, hearing the legend of their grandparents, the forced marriage that became the greatest love story Coyote Ridge had ever known. But Ethan and Clara knew the truth. It wasn't just about a bet or a forced marriage or dramatic confrontations with outlaws. It was about two people who chose every single day to work at love instead of giving up, who chose to build instead of destroy, who chose each other even when it was hard, even when it hurt, even when running would have been easier. That was the real story. Not taming or conquering or winning, just choosing. Every day, every moment. Choosing love over fear, choosing growth over stagnation, choosing together over alone. And in the end, that choice made all the difference. The stars came out above Coyote Ridge, and Ethan and Clara Cole sat together on their porch, still choosing each other after 40 years, still building their story one moment at a time. The bet that had brought them together was long forgotten by everyone except historians and storytellers. What remained was the love they'd built, the family they'd raised, the life they'd created from the most unlikely of beginnings. It was enough. It was everything. It was theirs. And that truly was where their story lived. Not in the dramatic moments that became legend, but in the quiet, everyday choices to love and be loved, to stay and keep staying, to build and keep building. The gambler and the quiet woman. The forced beginning and the chosen forever. The bet that changed everything and the love that made it worth changing. Their story was complete and it was beautiful.